Tonight, we begin something quietly unsettling and oddly human. We're going back to a time when life was short, illness was constant, and danger could come from something as small as a splinter. A time when people didn't expect to live long, because almost no one did. This new series is called Why People Died So Young in the Middle Ages. It's not about fear or shock. It's about understanding gently, patiently, how 1,000 little things added up to a world where almost everything could kill you, and yet, people kept going anyway. We'll explore the small details, dirty wells, bad bread, fevers without names, and beliefs that shaped entire lives. Some of it is strange, some of it is sad. Most of it, just quietly hard. Before we begin, if you enjoy sinking into this kind of slow, thoughtful storytelling, I'd be grateful if you liked the video, subscribed, or even shared where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. It always amazes me to see who's tuning in from the dark corners of the world. Now let your eyes grow heavy, and let's take the first soft step back into a world where people lived short lives, but full ones. Why most children never made it to 5. The morning light that slipped through a wooden shutter in a medieval village might have fallen on a mother's face, tired, quiet, still wrapped in the ache of a night without rest. Somewhere nearby, a baby stirred, or maybe didn't. In the Middle Ages, the early years of life were full of gentle danger. The kind of danger that didn't shout, but simply waited, soft, slow, and always near. Most children didn't reach their 5th birthday. In some towns, nearly half never made it to 2. And the reasons were everywhere. You begin with the birth itself. A child entered the world without doctors, without hospitals, without sterile cloth, born at home. In a smoky room, surrounded by women, some old, some young, all weathered by long years and long nights. The midwife might have delivered hundreds of babies, but she had no gloves, no soap, just a bucket of water, a knife she'd boiled in ale, and a whispered prayer to Saint Margaret or Mary. If the birth was slow, they waited. If it was fast, they prayed, and if the cord wrapped around the baby's neck, there were no surgical tools, just fingers, intuition, and the hope that someone, somewhere was watching from beyond. Even if the baby lived, even if it cried and wriggled and was wrapped in linen scraps and laid beside the mother, the danger wasn't over, it had only just begun. In the first weeks, the child might catch a fever. It could have come from the hands that held it, from the water used to wash its clothes, from the air itself. They didn't know about germs. They thought sickness came from imbalance, too much heat, too much moisture, too much humor. They fanned the baby with feathers, hung herbs in the rafters, placed coins beneath the cradle to ward off evil spirits, and sometimes they worked. Other times, the fever stayed. Breastfeeding was the safest option, but not always possible. If the mother was sick, or dead, or too weak, someone else would step in. A wet nurse maybe, or goat's milk, if you could get it. Or, in some desperate places, bread soaked in water and wine. The baby's gut wasn't ready for that. But hunger never waited for readiness. The smallest stomachs twisted quietly in the night, and often stopped moving before morning. Diarrhea. That was one of the cruelest killers. It sounds harmless to us, just an inconvenience, a reason to stay home and drink broth. But to a baby in 1350, it meant death by dehydration, quick, quiet, and often unnoticed until it was too late. There were no doctors who could come, no pediatrician, just the midwife again, kneeling by the fire, stirring something bitter in a spoon, hoping, if the child survived those first dangerous months, there were still years of risk ahead. They might fall into the hearth, they might eat spoiled food, they might be bitten by rats, they might catch coughs, or chills, or a rash that turned angry overnight. The teething years were terrifying. Fevers often followed erupting teeth, and though unrelated, they were blamed. Some children were burned to reduce fever, not intentionally cruel, just the belief that heat could drive out heat. Others were bled, with slivers of horn or sharpened reeds, because people believed illness was something to be drained. Still, through all this there was love. Mothers sang softly at night, even if they knew the song might outlast the child. Fathers carved small toys from bone or wood, animals with no names, faces scratched in with a nail. Older siblings guarded the cradle fiercely, protective and proud, even when they too were just 5 or 6 themselves. There was laughter, tiny feet in dirt, eyes blinking at the sun. These weren't hopeless people, they were just people. People living at the edge of medicine, and doing their best. Some babies lived, enough to keep going. Some grew strong, climbed trees, learned songs, became mothers and fathers themselves. But for many, the first years were the only years, and when they were gone, they were remembered with tokens, a lock of hair, a scrap of cloth, a name given to the next child. Grief didn't stop in the Middle Ages, it just learned to live quietly beside everything else. The church bells tolled for the dead, even the smallest, a tiny coffin, a quiet procession, and prayers whispered not because they made it easier, but because they made it bearable. And the next day, someone gave birth again, and the cycle began once more. Why you'd fear the fever more than the plague? The word plague echoes in the modern mind with drama and dread. Black hoods, carts of bodies, entire towns emptied. But in the daily rhythm of the Middle Ages, it was something quieter, something slower, that truly haunted people. The fever, not one kind of fever, but many, red, hot, creeping, lingering, with no name and no warning. It slipped under doors. It warmed the skin like kindling catching flame, and it was nearly always fatal, because they didn't understand what it was. It could begin with a chill. That was the worst sign. A shiver on a sunny day, a child trembling even as their hands were warm, or a mother suddenly too tired to rise. The fever was clever. It arrived without ceremony, and once it had hold, it stayed, flickering just behind the eyes, turning breath shallow, turning food to ash in the mouth. It didn't have a name. Not yet. No one called it typhoid, or tuberculosis, or rheumatic fever. It was just the heat, or the shaking, or the bad air. They didn't know about bacteria. They thought the body's balance had turned. Too much bile, too little phlegm, a sin unspoken, a night too cold, a god unhappy. The remedies came quickly, cloth soaked in vinegar, leeches on the back of the neck, prayers whispered over hot water. Some burned herbs to purify the air, sage, rosemary, mugwort. The rooms filled with smoke and the smell of sickness. Others cracked raw eggs into cups, believing the yolk would catch the fever, or they left onions sliced beneath the bed to absorb the heat from the body. If the fever broke, the egg was buried. If the child died, the egg was blamed for not being strong enough. The fever could last one night, or 6. It didn't matter, because if you caught it once, you'd likely catch it again, and the second time, your body was already too tired to fight. People feared the plague, yes, but the plague came in waves. Every few years, it was a storm. Fever was weather. It never left, and unlike the plague which moved fast and ended fast, fever gave false hope. You'd see the sick one, sit up, laugh, eat a little, stand, and then by sunset, they'd be drenched in sweat again, eyes glazed, muttering, gone by dawn. That kind of trickery made it harder to let go, harder to accept. Entire villages learned to live with fever. They passed down cures, cold moss on the forehead, foxglove boiled in rainwater, a copper coin held in the mouth for an hour, then thrown into the fire. It wasn't science, but it was tradition, and in the absence of knowledge, tradition is a kind of comfort. Some bodies fought back. That's what they said. He has a strong soul. She has the blood of saints. But the truth, some people simply got lucky. They didn't drink from the wrong stream. They ate something clean. They lived one room farther from the rats. Most didn't even know what spared them. They just thanked the sky and made another cup of broth for the next child who began to cough. There were songs about fevers, not loud ones, soft lullabies sung beside beds. Go now, little heat. Go now. Cool the brow. Cool the breath. They weren't meant to work, just to comfort the living, to quiet the dark. And when the fever finally took someone, the silence was thick, a single candle, a cloth soaked one last time, and a prayer that didn't ask for healing anymore, just peace. There were no answers, not then, but the people of the Middle Ages didn't wait for answers. They lived with questions, and found meaning in endurance. Not every death was fast, not every illness was loud. Sometimes it was just a fever, just a warmth in the body that would not leave, and slowly, gently, neither would the soul. Why a cold could kill you. It started like nothing, a chill in the evening air, a sneeze after walking through morning fog, a scratch in the throat, maybe, a cough so soft you didn't mention it. People didn't rush to treat it. There was no concept of catching a virus. A cold was part of the season, part of the air, part of life. But a cold didn't stay small. In the Middle Ages, it could become a storm inside your chest. Houses were cold, even when they weren't meant to be. Stone walls held in the damp, thatched roofs let in the wind. The hearth gave more smoke than warmth, and beds, if you had one, were sacks of straw shared with whoever else was in the room. Children coughed in the dark. Mothers shushed them softly, with no remedy except stillness and hope. And that little cough, barely noticed, could bloom into something deadly. They didn't have names for it. Pneumonia, bronchitis, influenza, those were modern words. Back then they said you had a chill in the lungs, or a wet wind in the chest. They believed air could get trapped inside you, that the body grew too moist, too much phlegm, not enough fire. The remedies: steam from boiled leaves, hot stones wrapped in cloth, a mustard poultice slapped onto the ribs. Sometimes it helped. Often it didn't. People feared the rattle, the sound a chest made when breathing became labor. That sound meant time was short, and they feared the stillness after, when the child no longer coughed, not because they had healed, but because they were too tired to try. The thing about a cold in the Middle Ages was that it rarely stayed yours alone. One child got sick, then another, then a mother, then a grandfather. Whole households whispered through the night, listening to each other breathe. They didn't have the option to quarantine. There were no spare rooms, no medical masks, no medicine, just a shared loaf of bread, a shared spoon, a shared illness. And if it didn't kill you, it weakened you. That was just as dangerous. A man with a cold couldn't plow. A woman with a cold couldn't cook. A child with a cold couldn't gather firewood. And without firewood, the house grew cold, and the next person fell sick. That's how it worked. Not in sudden collapse, but in slow spirals of struggle that left whole families quietly undone. Sometimes people survived. Of course they did. Human bodies are stronger than we give them credit for. But survival came with cost, lingering coughs that never left, wheezing that made stairs impossible, a face that aged faster, a mother who couldn't have another child, a boy who couldn't grow taller. A cold was never just a cold, not then. It was the first crack in a door that led somewhere darker, and still, they lived. They endured. They found warmth in ways they could: a shared blanket, a dog curled at their feet, a mug of warm beer passed hand to hand. They wrapped themselves in songs and superstition, and believed that, if the moon stayed clear, they might make it through the night, and sometimes they did. Why giving birth was so dangerous. In a village hut, barely warmer than the wind outside, a woman groaned softly in the dark. A candle flickered near her feet. A basin of water steamed, already cooling. She was not alone. There were women beside her, kneeling, whispering, wringing cloths between anxious hands. But the moment belonged to her, and to whatever came next. Giving birth in the Middle Ages was not an event. It was a risk, one that came without doctors, without clean beds, without guarantees. The very act of creating life brought women closer to death than anything else. The midwife was the only constant. She came with her tools: a small knife, a flask of oil, a crooked spoon carved from ash, and prayers whispered under her breath. She had no knowledge of infection. She'd never heard of blood pressure, or hemorrhage or sepsis, but she'd delivered 20 babies, maybe more, and sometimes the babies cried, sometimes the mothers didn't. There were no epidurals, no fetal monitors, no surgical options. There were hands, warmed towels, a cup of weak ale for the pain, if there was any to spare, and time, hours, sometimes days. The women around her, sisters, aunts, cousins, had seen this before. They knew when to hold her head, when to raise her knees, when to say nothing at all. They also knew the signs: when the color drained, when the bleeding didn't stop, when the silence meant something final. If the baby came too soon, it rarely lived. If the baby came too late, it might already be gone. If the baby came breech, they had no tools, just strength and fear, and the hope that it could be turned. They tried. They always tried. They tied charms above the doorway. They lit herbs, and let the smoke drift around the mother. They whispered to saints and ancestors, and the wind. But the body did what it would do, and sometimes that meant letting go. Some women died slowly, after the birth, of fevers, of pain that didn't end, of wounds no one could see. They called it childbed fever. They thought it was bad air, or sin, or sorrow, that stuck too deep. Now we call it infection. But names never changed the ending. Still, children had to be born. The world needed them. Sons to plant and plough, daughters to tend and carry and nurse. And so the cycle went on. A woman might give birth 6 times, 10, more. Each time she risked everything. Each time she wrapped her arms around a child and tried not to count how many she'd already lost. The survivors weren't fearless. They were just necessary. Mothers, grandmothers, midwives. They stitched up the living and buried the dead, and sang lullabies that ended too soon. They remembered names, kept scraps of cloth, told stories about babies who smiled before they died, and they kept going, because someone had to. Birth was the beginning, but in the Middle Ages, it was also an ending. Sometimes for the child, sometimes for the mother, sometimes both, and every family had already prepared themselves for either. Why doctors sometimes made things worse. The word doctor sounds comforting now. It suggests knowledge, healing, a white coat, a prescription pad, a quiet voice saying, "You'll be okay." But in the Middle Ages, the doctor was often the last person you wanted to see. Because by the time he arrived, if he arrived at all, things were already bad, and he might just make them worse. There were doctors, yes, but they were rare. Educated in Latin, not pain, more familiar with ancient texts than living patients. They quoted Galen and Hippocrates, but had never touched a wound. Their tools were scrolls. Their beliefs were inherited, and much of what they knew was wrong. The body, they thought, had 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Illness meant imbalance, too much heat, too little moisture, the soul out of rhythm with the stars. The solution: balance, drain, purge, sweat, bleed. If you were sick, a doctor might tell you to fast, or to eat garlic soaked in honey, or to swallow crushed pearls, or to drink wine boiled with lid, because it made the color of your urine more balanced. And when that failed, there was always bleeding. The doctor's knife was sharp, clean by accident, wiped with linen. He'd open the skin at the elbow or ankle and let the bad blood run, sometimes into a bowl, sometimes into the dirt, sometimes onto a patient's only blanket. People fainted, some died, and yet this was normal. A sign that the body was being reset, like wringing out a dirty cloth. Not all doctors bled. Some preferred purging. They'd give you powders, ground shell, charred bones, lizard dust. They might boil herbs until the scent turned sour, then force you to drink. And when you vomited, they smiled. That meant it was working. Pain was a sign of progress. Discomfort meant success. You weren't meant to feel better. You were meant to feel changed. The lucky had apothecaries, herbalists with jars and patients. They worked from the back of shops. Their tools were wooden spoons and fingers stained green. They mixed feverfew with vinegar, wrapped wounds in honey, spoke little, and watched carefully. They weren't called doctors, but often they saved more lives. And there were surgeons too, barbers, mostly, with blades for heads and bodies alike. They cut abscesses, amputated toes, filed teeth, and set broken legs with strips of soaked leather. They worked fast, because pain was constant, and time was limited. And when they failed, no one blamed them. They were simply doing what they could. In many places, it was the wise woman, the midwife, the herb wife, who helped the most. She knew when to use willow bark, when to cool a fever with damp moss, when to sit beside the sick and say nothing at all. But she wasn't a doctor. She wasn't respected. And when a patient died, she was sometimes accused of witchcraft, of negligence, of knowing too much. So when someone fell ill, families faced a choice: wait, pray, care quietly with broth and herbs, or send for the doctor, and risk more harm than help. Sometimes the doctor cured, that must be said. Sometimes, despite everything, people got better. But just as often, the visit ended with blood on the floor, and a house that went silent by the end of the week. Why they believed bloodletting helped. It sounds brutal now. A blade to the vein. A bowl slowly filling warm and dark. But in the Middle Ages, bloodletting wasn't cruel. It was careful, it was practiced, and it was believed, deeply, faithfully, to heal. Not because people were ignorant, but because they were trying to understand the body with the only tools they had: observation, tradition, and centuries of guesswork. To them, blood wasn't just a fluid, it was one of the 4 humors. Too much made you hot, irritable, feverish. Too little made you cold, pale, slow, a balanced body, had the right amount of each humor, in the right place, at the right time of year, under the right phase of the moon. Too much blood, you bled. It was that simple. The process was called phlebotomy, from the Greek words for vein and cut. But it wasn't rushed. It was ceremonial. A doctor, or more often, a barber surgeon, would inspect you, look at your tongue, feel your pulse, ask how you slept, then choose a vein. The inside of the elbow was common, the ankle, sometimes, even the neck, in the worst cases. They tied a cord tight, swabbed the skin with vinegar, then opened the vein with a sharp iron lancet, a narrow knife, flat and fast. The blood came quick, thick, steaming, sometimes dark, sometimes bright. They watched it, listened to it hit the bowl. They were looking for signs, color, clotting, how fast or slow it came. When it was enough, they stopped. Sometimes a cup, sometimes more. The bowl was marked, graduated rings etched inside, so the doctor could say, yes, this much is good, or 1 more ounce, and the fever will break. Afterwards, they'd bandage the cut with linen and herbs, sage, mint, ground pepper, mustard seed. You were told to rest, to avoid meat, to say a prayer of balance and recovery. If you were wealthy, your bloodletting might be scheduled once per season, 4 times a year, to keep the humors in check. It was preventative, like tuning an instrument. Monks kept records of their bloodlettings, so did nobles. They viewed it as maintenance, the way we might think of vitamins, or checkups, and if they felt tired afterward, it was a sign it had worked. There were alternatives, leeches for instance. They were cleaner, in some ways, attached behind the ear, or on the inner thigh. Let them drink their fill, then drop off. It was slower, less dramatic, but just as revered. Sometimes leeches were kept in jars, in cool damp places, fed on bits of raw meat between patients. A house that had leeches was seen as ready for illness. To modernize, it all seemed strange. Draining blood to cure sickness, reducing a weak body even further. But it's important to remember, they were trying. They saw blood as the heat of life. Too much heat meant fever, too much fever meant death. And they knew that after bloodletting, some people felt better. Placebo, maybe, or the natural cycle of healing, mistaken for cause. But to them it was proof that the body had released something bad, proof that they had intervened, and sometimes that was enough. There were failures, of course, deaths, even. People too sick to lose blood, people too poor to recover afterward. But medicine back then was built on patterns, not data, and patterns said this worked. So the blade stayed sharp, the bowl stayed clean, and the blood kept flowing. Why you'd avoid the barber with the knife? The striped pole outside the shop spun in the wind, red and white, meant to catch the eye. Today we see that pole and think of scissors and razors, haircuts and hot towels, but in the Middle Ages that spiral meant something else entirely. It meant blood, and bone, and maybe pain. The barber was not just a man who cut hair, he was also the one who cut flesh. There were surgeons, yes, educated, scholarly, trained in Latin and theory, but they were rare. They lived in cities. They cost more than most could pay. So in villages and small towns, it was the barber who stepped forward when someone needed more than a poultice or a prayer, and the things he did with the same hands that trimmed beards in the morning. His kit was simple: a razor, a knife, a saw, tongs, thread, and boiling water. When he remembered to use it, he had no anesthesia, no disinfectant, just speed and confidence. He pulled teeth. That was common. When decay turned to rot, when pain turned to swelling, when the mouth smelled of death, the barber reached for his iron pincers. There was no numbing, just a strong hand, a steady grip, and sometimes a knee pressed against the patient's chest. If the tooth cracked halfway out, he tried again. Sometimes the whole jaw came with it. He also set bones. If a leg was broken, the barber stretched it until the ends aligned. Then he wrapped it in soaked strips of cloth and hoped the bones would remember how to grow back together. Sometimes he used splints, wood shaved down from an old broom handle, or the flat bones of an ox leg. If the patient was lucky, the limb healed. If not, they limped for the rest of their days. Or worse, he drained abscesses, he lanced boils, he opened wounds that swelled without explanation, and when the swelling turned black, when the smell filled the room, he knew what came next. Amputation. It was the worst job of all. A hand, a foot, sometimes a whole leg. Gangrene meant death, unless the flesh was cut away. There was no clean hospital, no operating theatre, just a wooden table, a cloth to bite, and the barber's saw, sharp, fast, loud. He worked quickly. That was the only mercy, and when it was over, he dipped the stump in boiling pitch or pressed it into hot sand to cauterize the end. The scream was part of the cure, and yet people came to him because they had no one else. Because he had done it before, because sometimes, just sometimes, it worked. The barber was many things, a healer, a craftsman, a risk. Some feared him, some trusted him, most had no choice. He was the last resort, the final hand you reached for when the fever had gone too far or the wound had turned too deep, and when he washed his hands afterward, in rainwater or ale, he looked down and wondered whether he had saved a life or ended one. Why toothaches turn deadly. It might begin with something small, a dull ache in the back of the jaw, a twinge when chewing hard bread, a sharp pulse in the gums after waking. Nothing alarming. Not yet. You'd rub your cheek, drink cold water, say a quiet prayer. But in the Middle Ages, a toothache wasn't just an annoyance, it was a warning, and often it was the first sign of something far more dangerous. Dental care, as we think of it, simply didn't exist. There were no toothbrushes, no paste, no floss, no dentists in tidy offices with bright lights. Teeth were cleaned, if at all, with cloth, or twigs, or crushed salt. Mouths were rinsed with wine or vinegar, not because it helped, but because it stung, and food didn't help either. Bread was often mixed with sand from the grinding stone, meat was salted until dry, honey stuck in the crevices, and bones were chewed without thought. So teeth cracked, they wore down, they rotted, pain was common, infections more so, and when decay reached the root, when the gum swelled and pulsed with heat, the danger truly began. Because without antibiotics, a simple abscess could turn deadly. The swelling would grow, pushing the cheek outward, turning red, then purple, warm to the touch, painful to eat, to drink, to speak. At night, it throbbed. In sleep, it worsened. Then came the fever. The body tried to fight, but it didn't always win. And when the infection spread, to the neck, to the throat, into the bloodstream, death came quietly behind it. They called it jaw sickness, or the worm in the tooth. They thought a spirit lived inside the tooth, gnawing its way out. Some tried charms. Others used hot pokers, pressed to the skin outside the cheek, to draw the poison out. If the swelling burst, and pus drained, there was hope. If it didn't, there was only time. Extraction was the last resort, a job for the barber, or anyone brave with strong hands. The tooth was gripped with iron pincers, twisted hard, and pulled with a crack and a cry. Sometimes the tooth came clean, other times it shattered. If the root remained, the pain returned, and so did the fever. Some people lived for years with aching mouths, missing teeth, rotting stumps. They ate on one side, spoke with care, and swallowed the pain because there was no choice. Others died quickly. A single tooth became a swollen face, then a closed throat, then silence. It's easy to forget how much the mouth matters, until you see it fail. And in the Middle Ages, that failure was always nearby. A toothache could end you, not because it was sudden, but because it was slow, and constant, and invisible, until it wasn't. Why peasants couldn't afford to rest. There was no such thing as a day off, not for the peasant. Not for the tired father with a cough in his chest, or the mother whose hands ached from spinning flax. Not for the child with blistered feet. Not even for the old man whose back bent lower each season. Rest wasn't forbidden. It just wasn't possible, because in the medieval village, if you didn't work, you didn't eat, and neither did your family. A peasant's life was ruled by seasons, not clocks, not bosses, not appointments. Spring was for sowing, summer for weeding, autumn for harvesting, winter for praying the roof didn't cave in. Each task arrived like a tide, predictable, unstoppable, and always just a little too soon. If you were sick, you still walked to the fields. If your feet bled, you wrapped them in rags and kept going. Because the barley would not wait, nor would the sheep, nor the landlord's due. He wanted his share in wheat, in wool, in labor, and illness wasn't an excuse. There were no sick days. There was no doctor's note. There was only the hope that you'd feel better tomorrow. And if you didn't, you worked anyway. Because the rent was due, the hearth needed wood, and the children, even with their hollow cheeks and quiet hunger, still had to be fed. Some tried to rest on Sundays. That was the church's rule, a day of stillness, a day for the soul. But even then the animals needed care. The fire had to be stoked. The children didn't stop coughing. And if a fence had blown down overnight, well, God would understand. A woman might give birth in the morning, wrap her child in linen, and by evening be baking flatbread over an open fire. A man might return from the fields shaking with chills, only to rise at dawn again because the oats needed cutting. No one else could do it. There was no one else. Rest became something private, stolen. A quiet moment, leaning against the barn wall. A slow walk back from the well. A few minutes longer by the fire, pretending to mend a sock. Even sleep wasn't guaranteed. Rain on the roof, coughs in the dark, mice in the grain sack, a sick child stirring by the hearth, and still dawn always came. They endured, because they had no choice, because the body can be pushed further than we think, because they loved the people who depended on them. But it took a toll. The peasant body aged quickly. The bones bent, the teeth fell out. The skin grew pale, the heart, tired, and still they rose. That's why so many died young. Not always from a grand illness, not always from fever or plague, but from years of never stopping, of never recovering, of never being allowed to just pause. They didn't rest, because they couldn't, and in the end the only true rest came in the grave. Why you'd drink contaminated water without knowing? The water looked clear. It rippled gently in the wooden bucket. It shone in the morning light as it was poured into a clay cup. It even smelled fresh, like earth, like cold stone, like something meant to keep you alive. So you drank it, because you were thirsty, because the sun had been high all day, because your throat was dry, your lips were cracked, and this was the only water you had. What you didn't know was what else it held. In the Middle Ages, you didn't talk about germs. No one spoke of bacteria. There was no understanding of invisible things that floated in water and slipped into the body without a sound. Clean water wasn't a concept. Water was just water. If it came from a spring, it was trusted. If it came from a well, it was blessed. If it came from the river, well, that depended on where you stood. Upstream, it seemed fine. Downstream, that's where people emptied their waste. But no one kept maps of microbes. No one could see danger in the ripples. Wells were common in villages, hand-dug, ringed with stone, covered loosely with wooden lids to keep the leaves out, sometimes blessed by priests, sometimes marked with charms. But if the well was too close to the privy, or the midden heap, or the animal pen, the water turned slowly dangerous, not in color, not in smell, but deep within. And still, you drank, because beer and ale took grain and time. Milk was for children. Boiled water was too much work unless someone was already sick. So you cupped your hands, you tilted the cup, you swallowed. And if you felt strange the next day, well, it must have been the weather. Contaminated water didn't kill you outright. Not usually, it weakened you. First came the stomach pain, then the cramps, then the diarrhea. Relentless, exhausting, drawing the strength right out of your bones. Then came the fever, and sometimes, the confusion. Sometimes, the water carried parasites, things that stayed inside, made homes in the gut, fed from within. Wasting diseases, they called them. You got thinner, tired. You stopped eating, you stopped caring. Children suffered most. Smaller bodies, fewer defenses, one bad bucket of water, and they could be gone by morning. It happened often, enough that mothers grew quiet when drawing from the well, enough that some threw in iron nails or herbs, not to purify, but to ask for mercy. In towns and cities, it was worse. The streets were full of waste, chamber pots emptied from windows, gutters carried more than rain, and rivers, well, the river was everything. Drinking water, bathing water, sewage, all in the same flow. No wonder outbreaks came and went. Typhoid, dysentery, cholera, though they didn't call it that yet. Just the bloody flux, the sweating sickness, the wasting. Even monasteries, careful as they were, sometimes fell ill. Their wells, dug with prayer, still filled from the same ground as the fields. No one was truly safe, and yet people endured. Some stomachs hardened over time, Some bodies adapted, slightly. Herbs helped. Boiled barley water, garlic mash, mint tea. When water was feared, they turned to ale. Weak, cloudy, barely fermented, but boiled first, safer than you'd think. Even children drank it. But in the end, you always returned to the bucket, to the well, to the river, because thirst always returned, and the water, no matter how risky, was always waiting. Why boils were feared in every village. It often started with something small, a red patch, a tenderness under the skin, a little swelling on the back of the neck, the thigh, behind the knee. You might brush it off. A bite, perhaps, a scratch, nothing more. But by morning, it was hot, hard, painful to the touch. And before long, the whole house knew, because in the Middle Ages, a boil wasn't just a sore, it was a sign, a warning. Sometimes, a sentence. They had many names for it. Blight, blame, the burning mark, God's punishment. Some boils stayed small. They swelled, burst, healed, left a scar, a lesson. Others spread, fast, angrily. The skin darkened. The lump grew tight, like an apple beneath the flesh. Then it would split, and what came out wasn't just pus. It was smell, it was rot, it was fear. Healers tried what they could. Hot cloths soaked in chamomile, poultices of mustard and honey, leeches when the fever rose. Sometimes they lanced it with knives, blackened in flame, and linen strips ready to catch what spilled out. The patient screamed, and everyone nearby looked away, because they weren't just afraid for the one in the bed, they were afraid for themselves. A boil could be just a boil, a simple infection, a painful inconvenience, or it could be plague. The Black Death, when it came, wasn't always dramatic at first. It could start with a boil, a single swollen lump in the groin, or under the arm, the burr, they called it. And when it appeared, death often followed in days, so villagers grew cautious. They watched for swelling, for heat, for pain that didn't go away. If someone developed a large boil, people stepped back, families slept farther apart, food was left at doorways, and in some cases, the sick were quietly moved to the edge of the village, to recover, or not. Not every boil was plague, but enough were that the fear remained for centuries. Even when the great waves of death passed, people remembered. They remembered the children who coughed blood, the mothers who sweated through their linens, the men who fell silent one night and were buried by the next morning, all from what began as a boil. So when it came back, on the leg, on the arm, on the spine, they whispered, they lit candles, they tied red ribbons above doorways, they avoided the house, just in case. Because in a world without medicine, without answers, without rescue, a boil could mean anything, and too often, it meant everything. Why rats were only part of the problem. You've heard the story, of course. The rats came first, their black bodies slipping through alleyways, their claws scratching over thatch and stone, their eyes blinking in the candlelight. They carried fleas, and the fleas carried death. That's how it's usually told, but the truth is quieter, darker, more complicated. Because the rats didn't act alone, they were only part of the problem. In the Middle Ages, rats were everywhere. They lived in the walls, under floorboards, behind grain sacks. They chewed through wool, they ate crumbs and seeds. They birthed litters in the corners of sleeping rooms. But they weren't feared, not at first. They were just part of life. A nuisance, yes, but not a horror. Until people began to notice what followed them. The deaths came quietly, at first. A child with a fever that wouldn't break. A mother who coughed blood into her apron. A baker who collapsed before dawn and never woke again. The village priest said prayers. The healer burned herbs, but then more died. And more. By the time the sickness had a name, it was already everywhere. Some called it pestilence. Others said it was divine punishment. The reckoning, the great dying. And yes, there were rats, scurrying, feeding, multiplying. But they weren't alone. The fleas were smaller, invisible to most. They rode the rats' backs, hid in straw, waited in the seams of cloaks. They bit, and when they did, they left behind more than just a sting. They left plague. But even that was only part of the story, because it wasn't just the fleas, it was the filth, the crowded streets, the narrow alleyways, slick with waste and rot. It was the chamber pots dumped from windows, the butcher's blood pooling in gutters, the lack of clean water, clean clothes, clean hands. It was the perfect storm. People didn't know what caused it. They blamed the stars, strangers, bad air. They lit fires to cleanse the breeze. They carried sweet-smelling herbs in their sleeves. They prayed harder. They punished themselves. All while the sickness moved silently from house to house, not always carried by rats, sometimes by touch, sometimes by breath, sometimes by nothing anyone could see. The rats just made it easier. They were messengers, carriers, but they weren't the cause. The true danger was deeper, in the systems that allowed them to thrive, in the way cities were built, in the things people didn't know yet about disease and spread, and the delicate line between life and death. Even when the rats were gone, people still died. Even when the streets were quiet, the fever lingered, because once a sickness learns how to move, it doesn't always need a body to ride on. Sometimes, it just waits. So yes, the rats mattered, but they weren't the whole story. They were the shadow, not the hand, the scream in the night, not the silence before it. Why many starved even during harvest? You would think that harvest meant relief, golden fields swaying in the wind, heavy with grain, ripe fruit hanging low from trees, and baskets brimming with potatoes, beans, or barley. It should have been a time of fullness, a time when the hunger faded, and the long lean months were finally behind. But for many peasants, even harvest came with hunger, and sometimes it made things worse. Because food didn't belong to the ones who grew it. The village would wake early, before the sky even paled. Sickles sharpened, oxen yoked, cart wheels creaked in the dew. Every hand, every back, every blister mattered. This wasn't a gentle season. It was a race, against time, against the weather, against rot. But the grain wasn't yours, not all of it, not even most of it. If you lived on the Lord's land, you owed him a share, often the first and the best. It was weighed, counted, stored in his granary, not yours. You might watch your own wheat loaded onto his wagon. You might nod silently as your barley filled his bins, and you might wonder if there'd be enough left for your family. The church also took a tenth, a tithe, they called it, given gladly or not. It made no difference. The tithe collector came with scales and scripture and quiet eyes. Then came the market dues, the taxes, the payments for seed and tools, and by the time all debts were met, what remained might fit in just a few sacks, enough to last. Maybe, if there was no early frost, if no one got sick, if rats didn't find the storehouse, if the flour didn't go musty in the damp, so much could go wrong. Even during the harvest, some bellies stayed empty. The sick were too weak to eat. The old gave their portions to the young. The children picked over the scraps before the chickens could. And hunger, quiet but constant, lingered at the edge of every cottage. Sometimes the harvest was bad. Rain ruined the wheat, hail flattened the rye. A blight turned potatoes black before they left the ground. Those years were the worst. The grain wagons didn't fill. The Lord still wanted his share. The church still asked for tithes. But the peasants had little to give, and nothing to keep. In those times people starved openly. Bones pressed against skin, eyes grew hollow. Babies stopped crying, too weak, and adults grew silent, because speaking cost too much strength. You might see a neighbor take bark from a tree, boil nettles, grind acorns, and when even that failed, you might find the door shut, the hearth cold, and no one inside moving. Starvation didn't just mean death. It meant slow loss of strength, of thought, of hope, even in the season of plenty, because the system was never made to feed everyone, only to keep the wheel turning, only to reward the top, while the bottom bent under its weight. So the peasants kept harvesting, kept bending their backs, kept filling the carts, and hoping quietly that this year might be kinder. Why you'd die from a simple cut? It might have happened while cutting kindling, or slicing bread, or harvesting flax with a dull blade, or tending a stubborn sheep whose hoof slipped at just the wrong moment. Just a nick, a scratch, barely deep enough to bleed. You'd press a cloth to it, wrap it in linen, and keep working. Because pain wasn't unusual. Everyone was sore, everyone bore wounds, but some wounds didn't heal, and in the Middle Ages even a small cut could quietly lead you toward death. They didn't know about bacteria or sterilization. There was no word for sepsis, No word for infection, really just bad humors, or tainted flesh. If a wound began to fester, they thought the air was wrong, that God was testing you, or that you hadn't bled enough to release the sickness. So they cut it open further, or bound it with herbs, or prayed. But none of that removed the dirt from the blade, or the manure on your hands, or the fly that landed there while you slept. It started simply. Redness. Swelling. A dull ache that pulsed more each day. You tried not to look. You still had chores. Still had mouths to feed. Still had to carry wood. Knead bread. Shear wool. Mend fences. But the pain worsened. Heat crept through the skin. The wound oozed. And when you touched it, you flinched. Then came the fever. Your thoughts drifted. Your limbs trembled. Your appetite vanished. And still there was no doctor. Maybe a wise woman with salves. Maybe a neighbor with ash and wine, and whispered charms. But no medicine. No cure. Some wounds burst open. Some turned black. Some crawled with insects before anyone noticed. Others stayed quiet, invisible, just beneath the skin, until one morning you couldn't rise from bed. They might say you caught a chill, or were cursed, or were punished for something long forgotten. They wouldn't say it started with a cut, because that was too simple, too ordinary, but it happened often. A girl scraped her knee on a stone path. A farmer gashed his thumb on a rusted plough. A cook sliced her palm while gutting fish, and a week later, they were gone. Sometimes the healer would try bleeding, to release the poison. Other times they'd smear honey, or crushed onion, or pitch from a pine tree. Some treatments helped, most didn't. And when the body grew cold at the edges and hot at the heart, there was little left to do. They didn't fear swords as much as we imagine, not arrows, or axes, or wild beasts. What they feared was the wound that looked small, but whispered death, the wound that waited. Why fevers were feared like fire. It began with sweat on a cold morning. Marta noticed it first when she woke. Her wool blanket tangled around her legs, her shift damp at the neck. She sat up on the creaking straw-stuffed mattress, blinking into the grey light, thinking perhaps she had dreamed too hard. Something about running through tall grass, about the fields on fire, about voices calling her name and not stopping. The cottage was quiet. Her husband had already gone to the fields. The fire in the hearth was nearly out. And yet she was hot, burning. She shook her head, rose to stir the embers, and tied back her hair with trembling fingers. Just a fever, she thought. Nothing more. But in her village, people knew better. Fever didn't arrive loudly. It whispered. It crept. You didn't feel it all at once. You felt the warmth first, then the weakness, then the strange, unplaceable ache in your bones. You would still try to work, to stir the stew, to walk to the well, to mend a shirt. But your hands felt heavy. Your thoughts ran slowly. Your eyes blinked too often. And if someone touched your brow, they would draw their hand back just a little too fast. Marta wrapped herself in her shawl and stood by the door, watching the crows gather along the crooked fence. She heard her neighbor's door open across the path. Anselm, the weaver, coughing again. He'd had a fever last winter. They'd thought he'd die, and then he hadn't. But now he walked with a limp and forgot things mid-sentence. She closed her eyes. Please, not that. In the Middle Ages, fever meant fear. They had names for the types, the quotidian, that returned each day, the tertian, that visited every third, the burning ague, the sweat. But names didn't help much, because there was no remedy, only hope. A healer might come. She would carry bundles of dried fever few, and willow bark soaked in water, and a spoon carved from cherry wood. She would crush herbs between stones, mutter prayers under her breath, and lay cool cloths on the patient's chest. And she would wait, because that's all anyone could do. Sometimes the fever broke. The patient would sweat through their clothes, toss and mumble, then fall into a deep sleep, waking hours later with clearer eyes. But sometimes the fever rose higher, and in that heat the mind wandered. Marta found herself staring at the ceiling beams. Were they shifting? No, just her breath. She thought she saw her mother sitting by the fire, though her mother had died when she was 12. She reached out and called a name, but her voice came out wrong, thin, frayed, distant. Her daughter sat beside her now, wringing a cloth in a bowl. Her hands were too small to be doing such work. Boil the water again, the daughter said softly, just like Marta used to say to her. But Marta was already drifting. She smelled the fields. She heard bells. She saw snow in summer. Outside, the village carried on. The fields still needed sowing. The animals needed tending. The chickens didn't care who had a fever. People spoke in lowered voices. Someone asked the priest to come. The children were told not to visit the house. And above it all, the fever pulsed. Fevers killed more than war, more than famine. They could come from a bad well, a rotting wound, a sleepless night in the cold. They could take the strong, leave the frail, or vanish without reason. And even when they didn't kill, they left people changed, slower, thinner, forgetful, afraid. Because once a fever touched you, you never trusted your own strength again. Marta survived. After 3 days, the fever broke. She awoke soaked and shivering, the air cool on her skin. The girl was asleep beside her. The bowl of cloths had tipped over. She reached out and touched her daughter's hand, felt its warmth, and smiled faintly. She would mend again, stir the stew, walk to the well, but for weeks she would be slower, and for years when her body ached in the night, she would remember that fire, not in the hearth, but inside her. Why midwives were blamed when babies died. The knock came softly, always softly. Sometimes in the night, sometimes just after sunrise, a husband or sister or neighbor would arrive, hat clutched in hand, face pale, voice low. "She's starting. It's time. Please come." And the midwife would rise. She didn't wear a cloak of power or fine beads, just a worn apron, a satchel of herbs, a steady hand. She was no one special by title, but when a baby was on its way, everyone called her. And when the baby didn't survive, they often blamed her too. In a time when medicine meant leeches and prayers, the midwife was a thread between life and death. She knew which herbs softened pain, which oils soothed torn skin, which positions helped a stubborn child descend. She didn't learn it from books. She learned it from her mother, or another older woman, or from watching 20, 30, 50 births, each one different, each one dangerous. Because in the Middle Ages, birth was a battlefield, and most women didn't make it through untouched. She entered the home quietly. She set down her bundle. She asked for warm water, fresh linens, a candle that wouldn't flicker too much. She checked the mother's face first, not the belly. Was she afraid? Was she ready? Had this happened before? Then she listened. To the breath, the groans, the silences. The room filled with tension. The fire crackled. The floor creaked under shifting feet. The laboring woman cried out, and the midwife did what she could. But not every baby arrived safely. Not every body bent the right way. Not every cord waited patiently. Not every heart beat long enough. Sometimes the child was born, and didn't cry. Sometimes it cried, and then stopped. Sometimes the mother bled too much, too fast, and slipped away before anyone knew to scream. And in those moments, the room filled with silence so sharp it felt like a knife. The husband stared. The mother-in-law whispered. The priest shook his head. The women crossed themselves. And someone, always someone, looked at the midwife. Did she bring the wrong herb? Was she too slow, too calm? Did she anger God somehow? Why did she not save them? She had no protection, no guild, no degree, only what she knew, what she remembered, and the names whispered about her in the market. Some called her a healer, others, a hedge witch, a woman who knew too much, or not enough. If a baby was born healthy, thanks were mumbled. If a baby was born sick or dead, the midwife bore the weight, even when it wasn't fair, even when there was nothing anyone could have done. They said she rubbed strange oils. They said she spoke to spirits. They said she brewed teas from things that grew too close to the graveyard. No one questioned the priest. No one questioned the husband who came home too late. But the midwife, she was always nearby, and so she was always suspect. Still she came. When the next knock came at night, when the next cry rose in the wind, when another woman clutched her belly and prayed not to die, the midwife came. She boiled the water. She tied the cord. She wiped the blood. She waited for the first breath, or the last, and she kept the stories to herself, because she knew that sometimes birth meant joy, and sometimes it meant a tiny silent body, wrapped in linen before dawn. Why burial happened so fast? No one rang the church bell right away. The house was too quiet for that. They waited until the body was still, truly still, and then someone walked down the path alone, with slow steps, to speak to the priest. She had died just before dawn. Her breath had grown shallow through the night, then vanished, as if the air had simply forgotten her. She was wrapped in the blanket she'd slept in, still warm for a while, but there wasn't much time. By sundown, she would be in the ground. They didn't delay, couldn't. There was no ice. No chemicals, no embalming, no preservation. The body changed quickly, within hours. And if you waited too long, you could smell it in the walls. So they acted. The village women arrived quietly, not many. 2, maybe 3. They spoke softly, only when needed. They brought cloth and a bowl of warm water. They cleaned her hands, wiped her face, closed her eyes with gentle fingers. They tied her jaw shut with linen, so it wouldn't fall open before the priest came. They placed coins on her eyelids, or tiny smooth stones, just long enough to keep them from drifting back open. They worked quickly, but with care, and when they were done, she looked like she was sleeping, just sleeping. But they all knew. The shroud came next. No coffin, not for a peasant, just a winding sheet, or a blanket folded twice. Sometimes stitched closed at the feet, sometimes left open at the top, so the priest could see the face one last time. She lay on the table beside the hearth, where the bread was usually sliced. By afternoon, the first visitors came. Not many. People stopped by the door, offered a prayer, left a loaf, nodded without words. And by mid-afternoon, the men came to dig the grave. It had to be deep, at least the length of a shovel handle, to keep animals out, to keep spirits in. The ground was soft that summer, easier digging than last winter, when they had to break frost with iron picks and carry the body on a sled. By the time the sun tilted west, the priest had arrived. He brought incense, a small book, and a voice that didn't tremble anymore. He'd done this too many times. The walk to the graveyard was short, just past the last row of cottages, behind the old thorn bush where birds gathered in the evenings. They carried her on a board, not a cart, not on shoulders, no hymns, no choir, just footsteps in dirt, and the rustle of linen in the breeze. The burial was quiet, a few words, a cross of rough wood, a name scratched with a knife, and then they covered her, quickly, not to rush, not out of disrespect, but because that was what you did. You let the body go, before it changed too much, before it reminded you that it was no longer her. The earth was still warm when they returned home. The house smelled of herbs now, mint, thyme, lavender rubbed between the beams to chase away what lingered. The fire was stoked again, bread was cut, life somehow resumed. Because in those days, death happened often, and burial came swiftly, before the mourning could swell too large to bear. Why you'd never see a real doctor. You'd heard the word before, doctor. It sounded distant, foreign, important. They said he lived in the city, far beyond the woods, past the toll road, beyond the high bridge where the river ran wide and cold. He wore robes, they said, velvet ones, with gold buttons and rings that caught the light. He had books, shelves of them, written in Latin, written in Greek, too precious to touch. He knew things, but you'd never seen him, and you probably never would. Not because he didn't exist, but because he didn't come here. You lived in a village of 50 souls, give or take, a stone chapel, a single blacksmith, a market once a week, if the weather was fair. When someone fell ill, you didn't send for a doctor. You sent for the midwife, the herb woman, the neighbor with the steady hands and the bottle of willow bark steeped in cider. You sent for someone who knew you, not someone with a title. Doctors, real doctors, were for nobles, for people with coin and carriages and land enough to count by the acre. They didn't ride muddy roads to tiny cottages. They didn't trudge through fields just to see a boy with fever. They stayed behind city gates, in stone buildings, near libraries and courts and chapels, gilded with light. They wrote letters, diagnosed kings, attended rich weddings and slow perfumed deaths. They were men of knowledge, and that made them far away. Sometimes if your lord grew ill, one might come through the village. You'd hear the hoofs first, the bells on the reins, the rustle of velvet as he passed without looking down. You might peer from a doorway, catch a glimpse of pale hands, the edge of a red sleeve, a pouch that clinked with vials. But he wouldn't stop, wouldn't look, not at you, not at your mother, coughing by the fire, not at your child, shivering under a sheepskin. And so, you learned what your ancestors knew. How to make poultices from elder bark, how to soothe pain with nettles and prayer, how to bleed a wound and bind it with cobwebs. You learned to trust the hands that shook slightly, but knew where the fever settled, the ones that stayed when the crying started, the ones who came at midnight and didn't ask for coin. A real doctor might have saved someone, once, maybe, but they never came. Not for people like you, and in time you stopped expecting them. Why so many died in winter? It always started before the snow. In early autumn, before the trees had fully dropped their leaves, people were already preparing. They knew what was coming. The shortening days, the hardening ground, the long silence. You could smell it in the air. Wet bark, cold smoke, the last warmth slipping out of the soil. By the time the frost came for good, it was already too late for some. In a medieval village, winter was not just a season. It was a test, and not everyone made it through. By November, the animals were brought into stalls, thick with straw. The vegetable stores were sealed. The root cellar was checked for rot. Bread was baked in heavy loaves, and the last of the herbs were tied and hung to dry near the rafters. Every cottage was sealed as best it could be, blankets stuffed into window cracks, moss pushed into the eaves. But the cold still crept in. You could see your breath in the mornings. You could feel the wind under the door, even with it shut. And firewood. Firewood was everything. If you had enough, the hearth stayed lit. If you didn't, your fingers stiffened, your water froze in the bucket, and your teeth ached from the cold, even before you got sick. That was the thing. Sickness always came with the cold. The smallest things could become dangerous. A cough, a chill, a cut that wouldn't heal. They festered in the dark months. People grew weaker, not just from illness, but from stillness. Their bodies slowed, their spirits dulled. Food ran thin. The harvest was over, and whatever had been gathered was all there was. If rats got into the grain, if mold found the salted meat, there was no replacing it. Some families rationed bread down to crusts. Mothers gave their bowls to children. The elderly stopped eating entirely, quietly, voluntarily, and slowly they faded. No one went outside unless they had to. The paths were frozen, the wells iced over, church bells rang muffled behind layers of snow. Inside, people slept longer, spoke less. They bundled under furs and old wool, waiting for the warmth to return. But for some it never did. You'd wake to find someone cold beside you, a parent, a child, a sibling who had been coughing too long. There were no funerals in winter, only quick burials, if the ground allowed. Some years the frost made the earth too hard to dig. Then the bodies were kept in the chapel until spring, wrapped and still, waiting under the stones. People didn't cry much. Grief was quiet. It had to be, because survival took all the energy there was. Winter took the lonely, the old, the newborns, the sick. It took those who had already been surviving by threads. And yet, every winter the village held on. The baker still baked, the healer still stirred her pot, the blacksmith's forge burned low, but steady. There was always someone watching the fire, because if you could just make it to March, the world would soften again. The sun would feel warm, even through cold air. The trees would drip, the hens would begin to lay again, and you'd start to forget, just a little, how many you'd lost. Why war left wounds that never healed? He came back in the spring. No one saw him arrive. One day the road was empty. The next, there he was, walking slowly past the edge of the village, carrying a bundle over his shoulder, clothes crusted with old mud. His beard was longer than before. His eyes didn't land on anyone for long. It had been 3 years. Some thought he'd died. Others whispered he'd deserted. But when he stepped across the threshold of his mother's house, she didn't ask anything. She just opened the door and let him sit. He didn't speak for a full day. War took many things. Lives, obviously. Sons, fathers, friends. But what people rarely talked about was what it did to the ones who survived. Because those men came back different. Not all of them. Not right away. Some laughed too loudly when they drank. Some told stories no one quite believed. But others didn't speak much at all. They jumped at noises. They winced at the sound of boots in gravel. They flinched when a dog barked. They never wanted to sit with their backs to the door. No one had a name for it. There was no word for trauma, no concept of a wound you couldn't see, but everyone recognized it. Sometimes it was physical, a limp from an arrow wound that never healed right, a twisted arm, a missing hand, scars that puckered the skin across the chest or jaw, wounds treated on the battlefield with nothing but wine and pressure. The lucky ones got infected quickly and died. The rest lived, half healed. But many injuries didn't leave marks, just silence. A man who couldn't sleep through the night, one who refused to touch a blade ever again, one who drank more each year until he stopped coming to the harvest at all. People said they were off, that the war had shaken something loose. But the truth was simpler. They had seen too much, done too much. lost too much, and no one had ever taught them how to live after that. You weren't supposed to talk about what it was like, not the mud, not the sound of bones breaking under iron, not what it felt like to see your friend fall, and to keep running. You came home, you nodded to your neighbors, you worked the land, that was expected. But war didn't end when the fighting stopped, it stayed in your hands, in your dreams, in the way you stood, a little apart from everyone else. Even years later, the wounds stayed. The old soldier would sit by the fire with his back to the wall, staring into the embers. When children played at sword fighting in the yard, he'd quietly walk inside. When thunder rolled, he would cover his ears before he even knew why. When a rooster crowed too suddenly, he would turn and look for something that wasn't there. His mother never asked. The healer didn't offer herbs, because what could they give him? What could soothe what he had carried home? He lived another 10 winters, worked slowly, ate sparingly, rarely smiled. But sometimes when the dusk came early, he would tell a short story to a child, just one. Something about a fox, or a soldier, with no boots, or a lucky stone. And for a moment, his voice warmed. But the next morning, he was quiet again, and the child never asked for another story. Why you'd risk death to boil water. It wasn't the kind of danger people talked about, not like wolves in the woods, or bandits on the road, or sickness carried by wind and touch. This was quieter, smaller. It came from need, because when you wanted hot water in the Middle Ages, you had to build a fire, and to build a fire, you needed wood, and to get wood, you had to go outside. That morning the frost hadn't lifted. The trees stood like ghosts beyond the edge of the fields, white with cold. The sky was low and grey, and the wind moved through the branches, like a warning. Marta stepped outside, anyway, bucket in hand, shawl wrapped tight. Her child had a fever. They needed warm water, just a little, to mix with herbs, to wipe a face, to ease the trembling. There was no more left by the hearth. The last fire had burned out during the night. She'd used the final scraps of kindling hours ago, so she went to the woods. Wood was life. Every cottage needed it, for heat, for cooking, for boiling and washing and surviving. But gathering it wasn't safe. The nearest forest had been picked clean near the edge. Anything close had already been taken. The fallen branches, the snapped twigs, the dry bark. To find more you had to go deeper, past where the village dog followed, past where you could still see the thatched rooftops behind you. And the deeper you went, the darker it felt. People got lost sometimes, especially in winter, especially in fog, especially when they went alone. And there were stories of men disappearing with their carts half loaded, of women who didn't come back, their scarves found days later snagged on low branches. Wolves didn't often come that close anymore, but they might. Hunger made animals bold, and people too. Once Marta had seen boot prints where there shouldn't have been any, just past the edge of the old path. She hadn't stayed to check. She turned around, wood or no wood. But today she didn't turn back. Her child's fever was rising, and so she walked, boots cracking over frozen ground, breath tight in her throat. She found a fallen branch under the pine roots, too big to carry whole. She broke it across a rock, once, twice, until it snapped. She turned back, only when her hands began to lose feeling. Every minute mattered. Back home she lit the fire with trembling fingers, fed the kindling, waited for the flame, warmed the pot. The water boiled slowly, the room filled with the sharp scent of heat and wet wood. She dipped the cloth and turned to her child, whispering softly, wiping his forehead with care. And that moment, quiet, small, was what she had risked her life for. In winter, even a little warmth was everything. Even a bowl of boiled water could mean the difference between fading and staying. There was no tap to turn, no matches to strike, no stocked cupboard of clean cloths. Only the cold, the trees, and the fire you could make with what your own hands carried home. Why saints were asked to cure sickness. It started the way it usually did, with a cough that didn't go away, with skin that felt hot for too many days, with someone in the house growing too quiet to pretend they were just tired, and when the herbs didn't help, when the broth didn't soothe, when the healer shrugged and said she'd done all she could, that's when someone suggested it. We should ask the saint, not out loud, not like a conversation, more like a quiet breath, shared between two people, too tired to hope for anything else. There wasn't much else to turn to. You didn't have a doctor. The herb woman had already come twice. The priest had said his blessing and left with a look that said prepare. So you lit a candle, you knelt, and you spoke not to anyone you could see, but to someone who they said had once been merciful. A saint, maybe it was Saint Sebastian. He'd been shot with arrows and lived. People thought he was good for plagues. There were carvings of him in the chapel, tied to a tree, face calm. Or maybe Saint Apollonia, for toothaches, so sharp they made men cry. Or Saint Dymphna, for those who whispered strange things or wandered into the forest at night. There were saints for everything, because people needed them to be. You didn't pray with shouting, not when someone was sick in the next room. You whispered. You lit the wax with trembling hands. You rubbed your fingers over a wooden icon, worn smooth from generations before. Sometimes, you left an offering, a small loaf of bread, a sprig of rosemary, a strip of cloth from the sick one's sleeve, just something to say, please, and when the fever broke, you believed it had worked. Because what else could explain it? Why someone who had seemed near death suddenly opened their eyes? Why they asked for broth? Why they lived? The saint had heard you, and if they didn't, if the sick one didn't wake, then the saint had simply chosen to guide them gently to the other side. Not a failure, just a different kind of mercy. People didn't expect miracles. Not really. They just wanted to believe there was someone listening. Someone beyond this world who understood pain, who had once suffered, and who might, if asked humbly enough, help ease a little of it. There was something comforting in that, in believing that healing could come from the quiet light of a candle, that saints walked invisibly beside the poor, because no one else would, that if you asked the right way, with an open heart, a hand might reach through the dark and lift you, just enough to survive the night. Why bleeding was considered a cure-all? The boy had been sick for 2 days, not terribly, just enough that he wasn't eating, barely drinking, too warm under the blanket, even as he shivered. His mother had tried what she knew. She crushed the dried fever-few between 2 stones, and stirred it into wine. She pressed cold cloths to his neck. She whispered a prayer to Saint Blaise, just in case, but nothing changed. He only slept, and when he woke, he looked through her, not at her. That was when they called for someone else. Not a doctor, there wasn't one, anywhere near the village, but a man who travelled with tools, a man who had seen many fevers before, and had one solution for nearly all of them. He carried a small iron blade wrapped in cloth, and when he arrived, he simply said, "It's time to let the bad blood out." In the Middle Ages, bleeding wasn't just a treatment, it was a belief. Illness wasn't thought to come from germs or viruses. No one had microscopes, or a way to understand invisible causes. What they did have was a theory, one handed down from old Greek texts and repeated by generations of physicians and folk healers alike. They believed the body held 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. When those humours were in balance, a person was healthy. But when one rose too high, especially blood, it had to be reduced, and so they cut. It wasn't always violent. Sometimes it was just a shallow nick on the inside of the arm, a trickle into a small bowl. Other times it was done with leeches, smooth, cold creatures placed behind the ear or on the soft parts of the leg, left there until they swelled with blood and dropped off. There were rules. You bled different body parts for different illnesses. Too much heat in the liver, bleed from the right arm. A headache from bad vapors, maybe behind the knee. For women with a fever after childbirth, it might be the ankle. Even the timing mattered. Some believed bleeding was best done during certain phases of the moon, too soon or too late, and it might weaken the patient beyond saving. People didn't think it was cruel, they thought it was science, and sometimes, strangely, it worked. At least, it looked like it did. If the illness passed, people credited the bleeding. If the patient died, it meant the sickness had already gone too far. No one questioned the method, only the timing. Back in the cottage, the boy flinched as the blade touched his skin. His mother held his shoulders. She didn't cry, she just watched, waiting for something to change. The blood came slowly, dark, thick. They caught it in a bowl, then pressed a clean cloth against the cut. Then they waited. By morning he was still. Not better, not worse. The man packed his blade. He nodded without speaking. He had another village to visit by nightfall. The mother sat by the hearth, the cloth stained red beside her. She didn't know if the bleeding had helped, but she knew she had done something. And in a world with so few choices, that was often the most you could hope for. People bled for fevers, for pain in the head, for melancholy, for madness, for swollen joints and childbirth gone wrong. It was done in castles and in barns, in monasteries and alleyways, and for centuries, no one imagined there could be another way. Why you die in the field? Not the bed. He left before sunrise. The ground was still damp, the kind of wet that never quite dried after the last frost. A rough piece of bread in one hand, a small dull blade in the other. There was work to do. His wife had told him to rest. He hadn't looked well, face pale, stomach twisting, joints aching in the morning cold. But he'd shrugged it off. There was no one else to mend the wall behind the sheepfold, no one else to pull the weeds choking the barley, and the rent was due at the month's end. So he went. That's how it was. You didn't die in a bed, with clean linen and soft light. You worked until you couldn't, and often that meant you worked until your last breath. Beds were for the rich, a full straw mattress, a fire close by, someone to sit with you while you faded. That was a luxury. For most, death didn't wait for comfort. It came in the field, in the rain, mid-step between furrows, or on the cart, bringing hay. It came quietly sometimes, like a sudden weakness in the legs, a drop to the knees, and then nothing. Or it came with pain, gripping the chest, stealing the breath, leaving someone gasping in dirt, staring up at the sky they had labored under all their life. When people spoke of someone dying peacefully in bed, it wasn't because that was normal, it was because that was rare. Work didn't pause for age or illness. There were mouths to feed, and fields didn't sow themselves. If your hand could still grip a tool, you were expected to use it. Rest was only earned when the body gave out entirely, and even then someone else had to take your place before the sun went down. Sometimes they found him at midday, face turned to one side, eyes open, fingers still curled around the hoe. There was no doctor to call, no rush to save. The priest was fetched, the tools were gathered, and the body was carried home on the same cart that had carried wood the day before. The wife said nothing for hours. She just sat near the hearth, hands folded in her lap. She didn't ask why. She didn't cry right away. She knew. That's how it happened. That's how it always happened. They washed his hands, laid him on the bench near the wall, lit a candle, and by the next dusk he would be buried. He wasn't old. Most weren't. But in the village ledger when someone died in the field, it didn't surprise anyone. They just nodded and said, "He worked hard," and then they went back to work themselves. Why old people weren't really old? He looked old, bent over at the back, white in the beard, even though it barely reached his chin. He walked with a limp, slow and stiff. His hands were always curled slightly from years of grasping tools in the cold. But he was 38, people still called him the old one. Sometimes with respect, sometimes with surprise. He didn't mind. In a village like this, if you reached your 40s, you were already rare. If you made it past 50, people whispered about you like you were already halfway into another world. In the records that survive from those centuries, the average life expectancy hovers somewhere around 30 to 40 years. But that number tells only part of the story. It wasn't that everyone just dropped dead in their 30s. It was that so many never made it that far to begin with. A fever in infancy, a difficult birth, a crop failure that meant winter came with no food. Death came early, and often. So those who did survive into their third or fourth decade had bodies already shaped by hard labor, cold mornings, thin soup, and long walks with too little sleep. They aged fast because they never got to rest. You could tell by their faces, not from wrinkles, but from the wear, the sun-darkened skin, the way they squinted in the daylight, even if their eyesight had already begun to go, the slowness in the way they knelt or stood, the quiet grunts when they sat down at the end of the day. They weren't frail, exactly, just used up, like a pair of boots that had been mended too many times, still doing the job, but one stitch away from giving out. There were no retirement years. You worked until your knees didn't hold, then you worked sitting down, shelling peas, plucking chickens, grinding grain, anything to keep contributing. No one expected rest. Rest was what came when you finally couldn't move anymore. And even then, people might ask you to stir the pot or watch the fire while they went to the fields. And so the old people in a medieval village were often younger than any modern grandparent. They just carried more years than their age could measure. Years of hunger, years of illness survived. Years of burying others and moving on the next day. Sometimes you'd see one sitting on a bench outside the cottage in the last light of evening, watching chickens, shelling beans, just sitting, and that was rare, because most of the time they were still working, still pulling weeds, still mending clothes, still walking down to the well. If you were lucky, you'd be like them one day. If you weren't, you wouldn't get close. Why pain was a normal part of living. She didn't remember the last time she'd woken up without pain. It wasn't sharp. Not exactly. Just always there. A tightness behind the shoulders from years of hauling water. Knees that clicked in the morning and ached when it rained. Fingers that swelled in the cold and stiffened around a wooden spoon. She never called it pain. Not out loud. She just called it life. Because in her world, discomfort wasn't unusual. It wasn't even noteworthy. It was what came from living past 30, in a place where no one had ever heard the word relief. There were no painkillers, no medicine to dull the throb, no one to say, take the day off. If your back hurt, you still carried wood. If your teeth ached, you still baked bread. If your stomach cramped, you still rose at dawn to milk the goat. Pain was part of the background, like the smoke in the rafters or the chill in the floorboards. You noticed it, but you didn't talk about it, because everyone had it. Everyone. Children hurt their feet on stones, tore their skin on thorns, cried quietly as they limped behind their mothers. Men with old breaks that had never healed right dragged one leg through the fields. Women worked while their bones ached from childbirth or their joints from long winters with little food. You bled, bruised, limped and twisted your way through every season, and there was never a question of stopping. There was no doctor, no bed to recover in, no one to replace you in the garden, or at the oven, or at the loom. You just endured, and sometimes the pain stayed. A split fingernail that never closed right, a burn from the fire that became part of your hand, a tooth gone black that made every meal feel like chewing gravel. There were moments, usually in the quiet after supper, when the room dimmed and the wind tapped at the shutters, when you'd sit still and feel every sore place in your body all at once. No one asked if you were hurting. No one had to. They were too. The word comfort didn't mean soft blankets and quiet music. It meant not being cold, not being hungry, not being in danger of something worse. Actual comfort, what you and I might call freedom from pain, was unimaginable. So people didn't wait for it. They didn't chase it. They just accepted that to be alive was to hurt, and that hurting meant you were still here, and that was enough. Why you couldn't trust the midday meal. It wasn't a feast, just a bowl of something warm, thick with barley, cabbage, and whatever root vegetables were still left from the last harvest. If they were lucky, a sliver of meat. If not, a crust of bread, scraped clean with a knife and soaked in broth to soften it. They ate in silence, mostly, not out of solemnity, but because chewing took effort when your teeth ached and your belly wasn't used to more than a few scraps. But even this, humble, meager, and familiar, could be dangerous, because food in the Middle Ages wasn't safe. It just had to be survived. Spoilage was a part of daily life. There were no refrigerators, no thermometers, no real way to know if something had turned bad, unless it smelled foul or tasted worse. And even then, hunger could make a person ignore their senses. Grain could rot in the sack. Cabbage could ferment in the pot. Meat, if it was old or stretched too far, could make your belly churn and your hands shake within hours. And water, that was worse. Most people drank small ale at meals, because water drawn from the well or stream might carry sickness, invisible and silent. But even ale could sour. Even milk could turn before it reached the mouth of a child. No one knew the word bacteria, but they knew what it meant to get sick after eating. They knew it very well. Once, a boy fell ill after the lentil stew. Nothing had seemed wrong with it. It had boiled for hours. It smelled fine. But the next day, he couldn't rise. His skin turned pale. His stomach cramped like a fist. The stew had been made in the same pot they'd used every day, scrubbed with salt and straw. The onions had been dried from last year's crop. The water had come from the same jug as always. But something, somewhere, had gone bad. And in a world without doctors, without diagnosis, without a plan beyond bed rest and prayer, there was nothing to be done but wait. Sometimes they got better. Sometimes they didn't. You couldn't trust the midday meal, not because someone meant harm, not because the cook had made a mistake, but because the line between nourishment and poison was thinner than anyone could see. Mold grew quietly in flour. Pots rusted slowly on the bottom. Cheese curdled wrong if stored too close to the hearth. Even the salt used to preserve meat could go off if it wasn't clean enough. And once, during a year when the grain came in damp, a sickness spread across 3 villages. They didn't know what it was. People went mad, had visions. Some burned with fever, others couldn't stop shaking. It was the bread, so people prayed before they ate. Not just from habit, but from real hope, that what they were about to put in their mouths would keep them alive, and not send them into days of fevered sleep, or worse. Because in a world where food was survival, and survival was uncertain, even a warm bowl of stew at noon came with risk. Why you'd sleep through the sickness and never wake up? It usually started with a chill. Nothing dramatic, just a shiver in the back, a heaviness behind the eyes. You might rub your arms, pull your shawl tighter, and go back to stirring the pot or stacking the firewood. Everyone got tired, everyone got cold. You didn't make much of it, but by the second day, you couldn't get warm, even close to the hearth. Your hands stayed pale. The weariness sank deeper than usual. Your body felt like it was carrying a weight that wouldn't lift. You told them you just needed to sleep, so you did. Sleep was the only medicine most people had. There were no real cures for fever, no real understanding of infection. If your body ached and your head burned, you were told to lie still and rest. Sometimes you were lucky. A few days of blankets and broth, and the fire passed. You woke up, shaky, hungry, and alive. But sometimes quietly, and without warning, you didn't wake at all. They would come in to check on you, see you still, breathing, maybe, murmuring nonsense or not speaking at all. They'd wet your lips with cool water, rub your hands, say your name gently, hoping for a flicker of recognition, and when none came, they waited. Sometimes hours, sometimes a full day, until the breath stopped, until the sleep became something else. They didn't know the words for what had happened. Maybe it was the ague, maybe a lung fever, maybe something carried on the wind or caught from a stranger's cough, but in the end it didn't matter what to call it. You had gone to sleep and never come back. It happened more often than people talked about, especially in winter, especially after a long harvest, especially when there had been a lean year, and people were already worn thin. A neighbor, a child, an elder. Anyone could slip from life this way. No shouting, no final gasps, just quiet, slow fading. They would wash your body gently, cover your eyes, lay a sprig of rosemary on your chest. They'd whisper prayers, not in grief, exactly, but in resignation. You were one more soul claimed in sleep, and when night fell again, those who remained pulled their blankets tighter, knowing that if the chill settled into them the same way, they too might drift into rest and never feel the morning sun again. Why being born at night was an omen. They always hoped it wouldn't happen after dark, not because they feared the birth itself, but because of everything that came with the night. The silence, the cold, the absence of light in homes with no lamps left burning, no one awake but the midwife and God. When a child was born after sunset, people didn't cheer, they whispered, and sometimes they crossed themselves, because a birth at night was not just inconvenient, it was considered a sign. In the old ways of thinking, everything meant something. The phase of the moon, the direction of the wind, which foot the baby moved first as it came into the world, and the hour, most of all. Daylight births were seen as safe. The sun watched over the child, warm and clear. Midwives could see clearly, and if things went wrong, help could be fetched from a neighbor nearby. But if the birth came after dark, things felt different. The flickering firelight, the shadows, the midwife working by touch, not sight. People said a child born at night would have the sight, or else be cursed by it. Some whispered they were destined to walk between worlds, to see things they shouldn't, to carry burdens not meant for their age. Others believed a nighttime birth meant hardship, that the child would face a life of illness, or grief, or wander far from home, not because they were evil, but because the world had started them in darkness. Of course, most of that was just fear. Old talk passed around hearths and in doorways, but the fear came from something real. Nighttime births were dangerous. The room was colder. The help was slower to arrive. If something went wrong, if the cord was tangled, or the baby didn't cry, there was no one to help. but the midwife and whoever else was already there. No clean water, no light, no time to spare. And if the mother bled too much, or the baby didn't breathe, there was nothing to be done. So the stories came, to explain it, to prepare for it, to give shape to the fear of those dark hours. They didn't curse the child, but they watched them, carefully, lovingly, and sometimes, a little warily, as if the night had given the baby something that couldn't be seen, only waited for. Most of those born after sunset grew up like anyone else, played in the fields, helped carry firewood, sat by the oven on cold mornings. But when they were quiet too long, or looked at you too directly, or said something strange in their sleep, someone might say, softly, "She was born after dusk, you know," and the others would nod, because that explained it. Why the rich still got sick. They lived above it all, high stone halls, tapestries on the walls to keep the chill out, floors made of wood instead of dirt, fires that burned through the night, dishes that never went empty, and yet, they still coughed, still paled, still sweated through the night and grew cold before morning, still died younger than they thought they would. Being rich didn't stop the sickness, it only changed what you were surrounded by while you suffered. There was a belief, back then, that bad air caused illness. That sickness drifted in on the wind, crept through cracks in the shutters, rose up from damp ground, or from the breath of the poor. The rich tried to guard against it. They burned scented herbs in clay bowls near the bed. They wore perfumed cloths, tucked into their sleeves. They held sweet-smelling oranges close to their faces when walking through town. But none of that stopped a fever once it settled in the chest. None of it kept the blood from going hot, or the skin from turning clammy. They had doctors, of course, people who spoke Latin, and carried leather bags and books filled with theories. But those doctors believed in balancing humors and bleeding veins. They knew how to feel a pulse, how to examine a pot of urine held to the light, how to recommend crushed pearls or ground-up beetles mixed in honey. It looked impressive, but it rarely helped. Sometimes it made things worse. The rich had soft beds, but that didn't mean they got better sleep. They had silks and furs, but you could still sweat through them when the fever rose. They had bread and wine and roasted meats. But food can't cure infection, and no amount of silver could pull the sickness out once it took hold. There were moments, quiet ones, after the servants had left and the fire had burned low, when even the lord of the house would whisper the same question the poorest mother in the village had once asked beside her child: "Will they live through the night?" And often, the answer was the same: no. Being rich meant comfort, it meant warmth and privacy, and more days without hunger. But it didn't mean protection. When the illness came, and it always came, in one form or another, it didn't ask who you were. It only asked if your body was strong enough to fight back, and very often, it wasn't. Why you'd die in a castle, just as easily. The stone walls didn't make you safer. They made things colder, quieter sometimes, more impressive to look at. But the sickness still came, whether you slept on a straw mat, or under carved beams with embroidered linen. Castles looked strong on the outside, but on the inside, they were like any other place. Full of people, full of waste, full of air that didn't move. And when something started to go wrong, no one could stop it. Not really. They brought her into the castle wrapped in wool. Her hands were shaking. Her face looked flushed but pale at the same time. The midwife said it was just a chill, but the steward had insisted she be moved. They thought she'd be better inside the walls. She wasn't. By morning, she couldn't speak. By sunset, they had begun preparing her burial clothes. The castle was grand, yes, but not clean, not in the way we would think of it now. The halls smelled of smoke and damp rushes and old wood. There were corners where water never dried. Rats moved through the storerooms like they lived there, because they did. Food spoiled faster than anyone admitted, and the same knife might carve a roast and then lance a boil without being washed in between. People in castles still shared everything: air, touch, illness, and when one person fell ill, the rest followed. Even the servants whispered that the fever was following the drafts, as if it moved like wind, as if closing the shutters or hanging another tapestry might hold it back, but it never listened. There was a girl, just 13, who worked in the kitchens. One day she was scraping bones into a pail for the hounds. 2 days later, she was gone. No ceremony, just a sackcloth wrap and a quick burial outside the gates. No one remembered her name for long, but they remembered she'd worked in the castle and died there, just like the old chamberlain who collapsed in the hallway one winter morning. just like the cook's assistant who got a deep cut from a cracked plate and died within the week. Just like the nobleman who stopped eating, who grew thinner and quieter until one day he never came down to the hall again. Being in a castle didn't mean you were safe. It meant you were walled in with your fate. The walls were thick, but the bodies inside were just as fragile. There was a quiet death that settled on those stones from time to time. Not war, not attack, just the slow creeping of something unseen. A fever, a cough, a wound that didn't heal, a belly that swelled or emptied without explanation. And once it started, it rarely stopped where it began. By the fire, after all the lamps had been dimmed, someone would murmur, "At least peasants die in the open air," and someone else would nod, because deep down they knew you could just as easily die inside a castle, and no one would even hear it through the stone. Why the church feared the body. She had never seen herself clearly. There were no mirrors in her home, just polished bronze that reflected more blur than face. No paintings, no portraits, no chance to stand still long enough to notice the lines, the curve of a cheek, the color of a bruise. She knew her body by feel, by weight, by pain, by the stretch of skin over bone when food was scarce, or the way her feet ached after hours barefoot on stone floors. But she also knew that she wasn't supposed to think about it too much, because the church had made it clear the body was a vessel, nothing more, a thing to be disciplined, ignored, and endured. To care for it too much was vanity. To feel too much in it was sin, and yet, it was the only thing she had to live inside. The church didn't hate the body. Not exactly, but it didn't trust it. Flesh could betray you, lead you into temptation, drag your soul down into selfishness or pleasure or pride. So they taught people to be suspicious of their own skin, to cover, to fast, to kneel until their joints ached, to sleep on straw or stone, to whip themselves when they felt impure thoughts creeping in. Discomfort was holy, suffering purified. The less you enjoyed your own flesh, the closer to heaven you might be. Priests preached from pulpits about the dangers of the body, how it could lead to gluttony, lust, laziness. They praised saints who starved themselves, who slept in cold caves, who refused to look at women or eat meat or bathe too often. Cleanliness was tolerated, but comfort was dangerous. Even medicine was viewed with suspicion. Some saw it as interfering with God's will. If you were ill, perhaps it was meant to be. Perhaps your soul needed testing. Perhaps the pain was a lesson you hadn't yet understood. The body, they said, was temporary. Only the soul mattered. This way of thinking didn't just live in sermons. It shaped everything. Women were taught to cover their hair, their legs, their shape, to walk with eyes lowered, to avoid anything that made them feel seen. Men were taught to harden themselves, to avoid luxury, to look at pain and keep walking, because to need softness was weakness, and weakness invited sin. There were stories of saints who wouldn't even tend their own wounds, who let them rot because to clean them was to indulge the body's needs. People admired that, not because they wanted to do it, but because they were afraid not to. At night, in quiet homes, people whispered things they wouldn't say aloud, that they missed the feeling of sun on skin, that they dreamed of warm bread and silk sleeves and someone's hand on theirs. But they woke and went to confession instead, because the body was not to be trusted, because comfort could lead to ruin, because desire, of any kind, needed to be shut away. Even in death, the body wasn't left in peace. It had to be cleaned in ritual ways, buried with care, but quickly. Decomposition was feared not just as nature, but as moral danger. Corpses that didn't rot fast enough were seen as suspicious. Corpses that did rot were reminders of why the flesh was never to be glorified. You weren't buried with tokens or jewels. You were returned to earth plain, anonymous, and still fragile, as though even in death you might be tempted. But the truth is, no matter how hard they tried, people couldn't fully forget the body. They still wept when their child burned with fever, still cradled hands that trembled, still felt warmth and cold and hunger and aching in every part of life. You couldn't separate the soul from the skin, no matter how many sermons tried to. So people lived in quiet contradiction. They prayed with their mouths while rubbing tired legs. They fasted, but dreamt of stew. They avoided mirrors, but still noticed when their faces changed. They feared their flesh and loved it too, because for all the church's warnings, the body was where every memory lived, every love, every sorrow, every single moment of being alive, and no one could pray that away. Why leprosy wasn't the worst illness? Everyone feared it. The word alone was enough to quiet a room. You didn't need to see it, just to hear someone whisper leper under their breath made you step back without meaning to. It wasn't the sores that frightened people most. It was what the disease seemed to mean. Leprosy wasn't just an illness. It was a symbol of shame, of punishment, of being touched by something no one wanted to understand. And the church made sure people remembered that. To have leprosy wasn't just to be sick, it was to be marked. But as cruel as that disease could be, it wasn't the one that truly haunted the Middle Ages. There were worse things, sicker things, quieter killers. Leprosy, for all its horror, moved slowly. A person could live with it for years. They might be cast out, sent to a leper house, or forced to walk with a bell, but they didn't die right away. They felt the change in their skin, in their fingers, in their bones. But it took time, long, painful time. And sometimes it didn't kill them at all, not for decades. But there were other illnesses that didn't give you time. No warnings, no slow decay, just a shiver, then a fever, then darkness. Take the bloody flux, dysentery. That came fast. You'd feel a twist in your belly one morning, and be gone by the end of the week. Your body would empty itself, violently, and there was nothing to do but wait and hope. Or the sweating sickness, that strange, fast death that came and went like a phantom. People would be laughing in the street 1 minute, and the next they'd be cold and soaked, clutching their chest, dead before anyone knew what was wrong. Plague, too, made leprosy look slow. When the plague came, it came like thunder. You could go to bed healthy and never rise again. A boil in the armpit, a cough, a blackening under the skin. Hours, not years. Even childbirth, something ordinary, could kill faster than leprosy. One wrong turn, one lost breath, and both mother and child were gone before anyone could even call for a priest. Leprosy frightened people because it was seen. The sores, the curling fingers, the hollow cheeks. But the worst diseases were the ones you couldn't see coming. A bad cut that turned hot and swollen. A cough that turned into blood. A fever that didn't break. Those were the deaths people didn't talk about as much, because they happened too often, to everyone, too fast. And there was another thing about leprosy, the cruel irony. In some places, those who were cast out for it ended up surviving longer than those who stayed behind. While the townfolk died of fever or famine, the lepers, isolated on the edge of the village, lived on. It was strange, unfair, and a quiet truth that no one liked to admit. Because if the leper lived longer than the healthy priest, or the well-fed merchant, then what did that say about God's will? There were worse things than slow death, worse things than being seen and feared. There was pain without explanation. There was silence without a cure. There was watching your child burn with fever while you stood helpless at the foot of the bed. Leprosy carried shame, but the others carried speed, and fear, and the unbearable fact that one moment you were alive, and the next you weren't. So yes, they feared leprosy, they shunned it, they wrapped it in religion and ritual and distance. But when you look at what truly tore through medieval life, what emptied homes, what changed villages overnight, what no herb or prayer or holy water could undo, you realize something. Leprosy wasn't the worst fate, it was just the one everyone could point to. Why they burned your clothes after death. The fire was already going when they carried the body out. It wasn't a large fire, just enough to burn a few things quickly. Cloth, mostly, a shirt, a blanket, the linen that had been used to wipe his brow. They didn't say much. No prayers for the items, no farewell, just quiet faces, sleeves pulled over mouths, eyes turned away. The man who had died had only owned 3 tunics in his life, and now none of them would pass on to his son. They would all go into the flames. Because once death came into a house, everything it touched was suspect, and sometimes the only way to be sure was to burn. Clothing in the Middle Ages was precious. A full outfit could take months to make. Cloth was spun by hand, dyed with care, stitched and patched and worn until threadbare. Every sleeve and hem carried labor and value. So to burn a person's garments after death wasn't wasteful by accident. It was fearful by design. Because long before anyone understood germs or bacteria, they knew this. When someone died of sickness, their things often brought more sickness, and no one wanted to risk that. Not all deaths were treated the same. If a person passed gently in their sleep, from age or exhaustion, their clothes might be washed, folded, passed on. But if the death came with fever, with coughing, or swelling, or strange colors in the skin, if the body had trembled or moaned or bled, that changed everything. Even the mattress straw would be carried out, even the cup they drank from might be smashed, and their clothes, especially those worn in the final days, were tossed on the fire, sometimes in secret, sometimes with ceremony, always with caution. They didn't know how sickness clung to fabric, they only knew it did. A daughter who wore her mother's apron after a fever death might fall ill herself. A widow who laid with her husband's robe for comfort could wake burning with the same sweat. It didn't happen every time, but it happened often enough, and in a world without explanation, repetition became warning. So the custom grew. Shirts, tunics, shawls, bed linens, anything too close to death was destroyed. Better to make do without than to invite the sickness back inside. Even the dead's shoes were sometimes burned. Leather didn't catch easily, but they soaked it in oil and made sure the soles turned black. It was easier than wondering whether footsteps from the grave had followed them home. Children didn't always understand. They would cry for the blanket that smelled like their mother, for the cap their brother used to wear when walking to the fields. But the elders said no, softly but firmly. No, child, the fire is kinder. Burning wasn't the only method. In some places, they buried the clothes deep in the earth. In others, they soaked them in vinegar or ash water, believing it might cleanse the spirit of disease. But fire was the most final, the most certain. There was something about watching the fabric curl and vanish that brought people a strange kind of peace. Grief was heavy, but fear of more death was heavier. And when whole villages had known what it meant to lose 5, 10, 20 souls in one season, burning a shirt felt like a small price. There was a silence in the air after the fire went out. A gap, a hush. The clothes were gone, and the body was buried, and the door stayed open for hours afterward, just in case anything unseen was still trying to settle into the walls. No one touched the ashes. No one spoke of what had been saved or lost. They just waited, watched, and hoped they'd done enough. Why you'd hide your cough in public. It started as a tickle, just a soft itch at the back of the throat, the kind that made you want to clear it quietly, shift your shoulders, sip a bit of water and forget it. But even that smallest sound, the quietest cough, was enough to draw eyes, heads turned. Not in sympathy, not in concern, but in judgment. Fear, calculation. Because in the village square, or the chapel pew, or the line at the baker's door, a cough could mean the beginning of something, something that everyone knew might not end well, and so you swallowed it, bit your tongue, clenched your jaw, and held your breath, until your chest ached from holding back what your body begged to release. Because in those days, coughing didn't just announce illness, it marked you. People weren't cruel, not exactly, but they had seen enough to know that one cough could lead to 10, and 10 coughs could clear a household, could silence a street, could bring down a town. It didn't always happen that way, but when it did, it happened fast. So fast that nobody forgot. There were stories, always stories, of the shepherd who returned from market coughing into his sleeve. A week later, no sheep, no shepherd, no family, of the baker's wife who lost her voice, then her breath, then her color, of the young girl who started coughing on a Monday, and by Sunday the bells were tolling for her. People learned, not through science, not through medicine, but through memory. They remembered how illness moved, how it found the warm corners of life and stole them, how the sound of a cough in a quiet room could change everything, so they learned to hide it. They coughed into sleeves, into cooking pots, into straw-filled pillows, or when they could bear it, not at all, they would press their lips tight and walk faster, hands trembling slightly. They would nod politely, speak as little as possible, and retreat before anyone could notice how pale they'd gone. Because once someone noticed, the whispers started. "She's not well. I saw him cough." I wouldn't let the children near them. It wasn't cruel. It was survival. Coughing marked you. At best, it meant you'd be avoided for a few days. People would stop inviting you to the fire. The market boys would pass your turn. Your neighbors might leave bread at the door, but wouldn't look you in the eye. At worst, it meant quarantine. Or worse, being turned out altogether. Not always by force, but by silence. By empty space around you where people used to stand. That was enough. And it wasn't always fair. Some people just had dust in their throats, or a bad winter, or too much smoke in the house. But fairness wasn't a luxury they could afford, not when one person's cough might become another's funeral bell. So everyone coughed in private, at night, into their bedding, in the woods where only trees could hear, alone behind closed doors, with the shutters drawn. People say fear spreads faster than illness. In the Middle Ages both spread on the same breath, so you learned to hold yours, just in case. Because in a world without medicine, without certainty, without second chances, a cough wasn't just a sound, it was a warning, and everyone had heard it before. Why you'd drink beer instead of water? The river looked clean, that's what made it worse. To someone who hadn't lived through it, the water might seem fine. Sunlight catching the surface, reeds gently swaying along the bank. Maybe a few children skipping stones near the edge, but the people who lived there didn't trust it. Not anymore, not for years. You could drink from the river, yes, but you might not live long if you did. She was just 6 when she watched her brother drink from the village. Well, it was a hot day, the kind that dried your tongue and made the bread taste like dust. He leaned down, cupped the water in both hands, and took a long gulp. 3 days later, he had stopped speaking. By the end of the week, he had stopped moving. They said it wasn't the water. They said maybe it was something else. A summer illness, a touch of the spirits, bad luck, bad blood. But her mother never let her near the well again, and she never forgot the taste of fear that came with the sound of someone swallowing water. Most of the time, the water looked fine, but what you couldn't see is what frightened people. Human waste, rotting food, dead animals, dye runoff, tanner's slop, all of it ran downhill, and the water ran right through it. Even in towns with wells, the earth below was full of secrets, shallow graves, broken privies, soaked refuse. You didn't need to understand bacteria to know it made people sick. You just needed to remember who died last week. So the poor drank what the poor always had, the safest thing they could make with what little they had. Beer. Not the kind of beer you'd picture today. It was weak, barely alcoholic, more like liquid bread, made from boiled water, grain and yeast. Sometimes it had a little bite to it, sometimes it was flat and sour, but it had one thing that water didn't. It had been boiled, and that made all the difference. Boiling killed what they couldn't see. They didn't know why. They didn't need to. They only knew that people who drank small beer didn't get sick as often. So even children drank it. In fact, especially children drank it. In some households, a toddler's first cup wasn't milk. It was ale, just strong enough to be safe and soft enough not to burn. By the time they were old enough to lift a mug, it was a part of every meal. Morning, noon, and night. You didn't need to be drunk to feel grateful for it. You just needed to be alive. There were moments, of course, when water was the only option. When beer had run out, or the grain had spoiled, or the brewing had been rushed. And in those moments, people drank what they could, carefully, with hope, with prayer, with the knowledge that it might bring more than just relief. Sometimes a single drink of water brought weeks of fever. Sometimes it brought nothing at all. Sometimes it brought death by morning. It was a gamble, one most people didn't take, unless they had to. So beer became more than just drink. It was safety, routine, a kind of medicine. In a world without medicine, even monasteries brewed beer. Not just for the monks, but for the sick and weary who came through their gates. Even pilgrims carried jugs with them, filled not with water but with something boiled, brewed and blessed. And in the evenings when the day was long and your back ached from the fields, the beer was there again. Not strong enough to blur your thoughts, just enough to make the food go down smoother, to help you sleep without wondering if the cough in your throat was creeping into your lungs. You drank beer, not to forget, but to stay safe, to survive. The water might have looked clean, but people knew better. They had buried too many who drank too deeply from the wrong stream. So they brewed, they boiled, they blessed the barrels. And when someone asked why the child at the table had a mug of ale in front of them, they answered plainly, "Because I want him to see tomorrow." Why plague pits were dug before anyone died. They began digging before the bells ever rang, before anyone had fallen ill, before the town crier whispered the first warning, before the priest gave his cautious sermon about God's wrath or divine testing. The pits came first. Always the pits. Just outside the edge of the village, near the old grove, or along the cart path where nothing had grown for seasons. The ground there was dry and dark, full of roots and clay, but easy enough to cut with a good spade, and so they dug, even when the sky was clear, even when no one was coughing, even when children still played barefoot in the mud, because everyone knew Once the plague truly arrived, there would be no time to dig at all. It wasn't superstition. Not anymore. People had seen what happened. Their parents had seen. Their grandparents too. The stories passed down weren't just stories. They were survival. Whole towns silenced in a matter of weeks. Bodies stacked like firewood in alleyways. Graves filled so fast, the ground barely had time to settle. So by the time word of plague reached the edge of the region, even a rumor, even a merchant who looked pale, spades came out, not out of panic, out of practice. There was a man in every village, maybe two, who didn't flinch at the task. They didn't enjoy it. They didn't talk while they worked, but they did it all the same. They marked out the ground in quiet, measured it with strides, knew the weight of earth in their backs, knew how deep to go, how wide, how many to prepare for, even if they didn't say the number aloud. Some had done it before, some had never stopped. Children were told not to play near the fresh pits. They did anyway. They were drawn to the strangeness of it. A great hole in the earth, left open like a question. And the adults, they looked away, pretended not to notice, pretended not to count how many times the shovel struck clay. No one wanted to be the first to die, but someone always was. Maybe it started with a sudden fever, or a dark swelling under the arm, or blood coughed into a handkerchief when no one else was looking. And when it came, when it truly came, it came like lightning, fast, blinding, indiscriminate. That's why the pits had to be ready, because once the bodies started piling up, no one had the strength or the time to prepare them. The living could barely keep pace with the dying. The priest could barely finish one prayer before being called to another doorstep, and so they carried the dead out, one by one at first, then by cart, wrapped in linen, sometimes just in the clothes they wore, placed gently at first, then quickly, then without pause. There were days when the pits weren't enough, when the ground was too full, when they had to dig a second, then a third. There were moments when the gravedigger dropped the shovel and vomited in the grass, too dizzy to keep going. When the wind shifted and carried a smell that turned every head, but they kept digging, not just for the dead, but for the living, because as long as the bodies were buried, there was hope. Hope that the sickness wouldn't spread, that the air wouldn't sour, that the disease might die in the ground, even if those it took couldn't be saved. And then, one day, the digging stopped. No more carts, no more linen bundles, no more names whispered in prayer, just silence. A stillness that didn't feel like peace, just exhaustion, and the pits remained, filled, covered, blessed, but never forgotten. Even years later, grass grew over the earth in strange patterns. Some villagers avoided those places, others passed through without a word, eyes lowered, but everyone knew where the pits had been. They never dug gardens there, never let animals graze too close, because you could never be sure what lingered, because in the next season, or the next lifetime, they might need to dig again. And so, even in times of calm, even when no one coughed, even when the taverns were full, and the baker's line stretched down the lane, the shovels stayed close by, and somewhere just beyond the trees, the earth waited. Why the death cart didn't always wait. It always made a sound before it arrived, the grinding of wood against dirt, the dull rattle of wheels over stones, the low groan of leather straps pulled tight. Sometimes the crows came with it, sometimes the silence did, but always, when the death cart came down the road, people moved aside, not out of respect, not even out of fear, out of grim understanding, because by the time the cart showed up, it was already too late. It wasn't a fancy thing. The cart, no paint, no carvings, just planks of rough wood, patched and repatched, the wheels uneven and often coated in dust or mud or something worse. It was usually pulled by one old horse, ribs showing, eyes dull, or sometimes just pushed by men too tired to pretend it made a difference. There was no ceremony to it, no bell, no incense, no hymns, just the cart, and the men, and the dead. But the worst part, the part no one ever said aloud, was this: sometimes the cart didn't wait for you to die. People had seen it, people had heard the stories of a man still breathing, barely, being taken out of his house and laid in the cart, because they said he wouldn't last the night, of a mother, feverish and whispering, still clutching her child's name, taken before she let go. It wasn't done out of cruelty, it was done out of need. When the sickness moved faster than the prayers, when the streets filled too quickly, when no one could keep track of who was sick, and who was already gone. That's when the rules broke down. That's when mercy blurred. When guesses replaced diagnoses. When the line between the living and the dead grew dangerously thin. Sometimes it wasn't even the plague. Sometimes it was hunger, or exhaustion, or cold. A collapsed man on the edge of the square. No one stopped to check his breath. They just called the cart, and he was taken. And who would blame them? When death moved like fire through the town, pausing to ask if someone might still be alive could cost more lives. So the cart came, took what was given, and moved on. And still, sometimes they got it wrong. There were stories of people waking in the pit, too late, too dark, no one there to hear their cries. Of groans under linen wraps, of fingers twitching beneath a shroud, of dirt falling on faces that still remembered air. Most people pretended those stories weren't true, but they were, at least once. So people learned not to wait for help. If someone in your house started to cough, you hid them. You kept the windows shuttered. You burned strong herbs to mask the smell. You prayed harder, louder, and if the cart rolled down your street, you didn't answer the knock, unless you had no other choice. Because once they took your kin away, there was no getting them back. Even if their chest still rose, even if they still whispered your name. There were families who dug shallow graves in secret, not to bury their dead, but to hide their sick, to keep them from the cart's eye, until the worst had passed. Some survived, some didn't, but at least then, it had been their choice. By the end of the worst seasons, the cart itself was no longer enough. There were too many bodies, too few hands, too little time, and so the cart stopped rolling. The dead were left at the roadside, in alleyways, stacked like firewood at the edge of the parish yard. The cart had never been meant for this. It couldn't carry the weight of a whole town. Nothing could. And then, when the wind changed, and the sickness moved on, and people came out of their houses blinking in the light, the cart was there again, not to collect, but to remind, of what had been lost, of who had been taken, and how close some had come to being taken too soon. So when the next warning came, years later, another fever, another cough, another whisper on the wind, they didn't wait. They cleared the roads, closed their shutters, and listened, with hearts clenched, for the sound of wheels in the distance, because they knew, sometimes the death cart knocked before you were ready, and sometimes it didn't knock at all. Why you'd never want to visit a medieval hospital. It sounded like a place you should want to go. A hospital, a house of care, a refuge for the sick, a place where holy men and women tended the weak and the wounded, where God's mercy lived in warm bowls of broth and whispered prayers. But if you were lucky, truly lucky, you never had to see the inside of one, because in the Middle Ages, the hospital wasn't what you think it was. It wasn't a sanctuary, it wasn't safety, it wasn't even hope. It was often the last stop before death. The building itself was quiet, always quiet. Stone walls, narrow windows, a smell that lived somewhere between vinegar and wet linen. You'd hear soft footsteps, distant groans, the rustle of straw as someone shifted in pain. If you were outside the gates, you might pass by with a bowed head, maybe offer a prayer, but you didn't linger, and you didn't go inside, unless you had no other choice. Because once you were in, you might not come back out. Hospitals were run by the church, and for good reason. Doctors were few and far between, and most of them treated the wealthy in private homes. The poor, the unwanted, the truly desperate, they went to the brothers and sisters of the cloister. The monks and nuns did what they could. They meant well, but they weren't trained healers. They were caretakers, and in most cases, care meant warmth, food, water, and prayer, not treatment, not medicine. They couldn't sew wounds closed. They couldn't remove infection. They didn't have antiseptics or antibiotics. They had herbs. They had leeches. They had a firm belief in balancing the humors, bleeding the bad, purging the worse, and hoping the soul made peace with the rest. And the beds, if you can call them that, long wooden frames, often shared a thin layer of straw. Sometimes 2 patients to a mattress, head to foot, coughing, sweating, moaning. There was no such thing as privacy. No separation between illnesses. If one man had the bloody flux and the other a fever, they'd share their breath, their lice, and their fate. There were no clean linens. Not really. Everything was reused, everything was touched, and if infection spread from one to another, it wasn't seen as a failure of cleanliness. It was the will of God. They did try. You'd see lavender hung from the rafters, rosemary bundles by the windows, holy relics tied to the bedposts. The nuns would read psalms aloud while tending to sores, wiping foreheads, spooning broth past cracked lips. But the air was still heavy with sickness. Always, you couldn't escape it. It clung to your hair, your breath, your skin. The walls absorbed it. The straw reeked of it. Some didn't mind. They were too far gone to notice. Others, young, scared, maybe even curable, started to slip the moment they walked in. Because there's a kind of hopelessness that seeps into your bones when the person beside you dies, and no one moves the body for hours. Just a cross drawn on the forehead, a whispered prayer, and then the next bowl of broth, ladled into the next trembling hand. There were worse places, of course. There were dungeons, pest houses, open graves. But the hospital was different. It was a place that carried the idea of help, without the power to deliver it. You went there when your family couldn't care for you anymore. When you had no coin left for a doctor. When your neighbors started avoiding your door. You went there not to get better, but to die in company. And still people hoped. A young girl with a swollen leg might pray for healing in the chapel before being laid down beside a man with open boils. A mother might watch her son fade slowly under the care of gentle hands and still whisper, "He's getting better." Sometimes, miracles did happen. Sometimes, but mostly, the hospital was a waiting room for the grave. That's why people hid their illnesses. Why they stayed home as long as they could. Why a mother would choose to boil her own poultices in the hearth rather than send her child to the care of monks. Because once you entered those doors, the world forgot you a little, not out of cruelty, out of truth, because no one expected to see you return. Why the smell of bread could be dangerous. There was something comforting about it. The smell of warm bread. It drifted through crooked streets just after dawn, winding between thatched rooftops and smoke-thick chimneys, curling into the noses of peasants stirring to life. It meant the ovens were lit. It meant the wheat hadn't run out. It meant for a moment something normal was happening. People followed it like animals, nose first, heart second, toward the baker's shop, even when their stomachs were tight from days of going without, even when the sky was low with grey, even when the sickness had already begun to spread, because bread was life, but not always. Sometimes, the smell of it meant danger. Most villages had only one baker, maybe two, a communal oven, perhaps, but rarely more. Flour was ground in the mill, measured carefully, and mixed with what they had: barley, rye, oats, wheat, if they were lucky. To that, they added water, salt, if it was affordable, yeast or old dough to help it rise. And then it went into the fire. The flames devoured the outside quickly, but inside, if done right, it stayed soft. A luxury, but not all bread was made well, and not all flour was clean. Some years were worse than others. Rain ruined the grain. Mice got into the sacks. Sometimes, the millstones ground too fast, too hot, and left the flour scorched. And sometimes, something else got in. Something invisible, a sickness in the grain itself. It grew quiet and grey, hidden in the darkest corners of the granary. A mold, harmless to the eye, deadly to the gut. It was called ergot, though most didn't know the name. To them, it was just bad bread, cursed bread, black bread, and it started with the smell. The scent was richer than normal, deeper, almost sweet. But once it filled the street, once it clung to your hair and stirred your hunger, it was already too late. People ate the bread. They always did. They were hungry. And then the twitching began. It started in the fingers. A strange tingling. Then the legs. The muscles would lock. Spasms. Cramps. Skin going pale. Then blotched. Then black. Some people hallucinated. Visions, voices, the taste of iron in the mouth. Others burned from the inside out. Their blood raced. Their minds fled. They screamed. They laughed. They wept into the straw, and no one knew why. The bread was never suspected at first. It looked normal, maybe a bit darker, maybe a strange aftertaste. But it was bread. Bread didn't kill people, or so they thought, but it did. In some towns, it became an epidemic. Entire families struck down after a single shared loaf. Children convulsing in the middle of supper, old men collapsing at mass, women raving in the streets, convinced they'd seen demons in the rafters. Some called it a curse, others called it punishment. The church blamed sin, healers blamed the stars, but the baker just stared at his hands and wondered what had gone wrong. Years later, some would understand, the rot in the rye, the poison fungus, but in the moment, there was only fear, and still people kept eating, because what else could they do? Bread was life. Bad bread was still something. If the choice was between a full belly and an empty one, most chose the bread, even if it cost them everything. So the smell of bread became complicated. It stirred the stomach, but it also stirred something else. Something older, something wary. It reminded people of what could go wrong, of what had gone wrong. And yet, each morning, they followed it again, into the streets, toward the fire, toward the oven, because even if danger hid in the crust, so did hope. And in the Middle Ages, hope was sometimes the only thing stronger than hunger. Why illness was blamed on the moon? It always started on nights when the moon was full, not just round, but bright. So bright, it felt unnatural, as if the sky had opened a single eye and stared too long at the earth below. The villagers didn't like to look at it. They'd glance once, then pull their cloaks tighter and hurry home. Because the full moon didn't just mean light, it meant change. It meant sickness. They didn't have microscopes. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses or the invisible crawl of infection across a spoon or a fingertip. But they knew something strange happened when the moon was full. People changed. Animals too. Milk spoiled faster. Bread rose too quickly or not at all. The chickens clucked wildly in the night, and someone fell ill. A headache that wouldn't stop. A fever that came without warning. A rash that crawled up the arms like fire under the skin. It wasn't every month, but often enough, and so they began to watch the moon. Not for beauty, for warning. In one village, there was a man who swore his son always took fever the night the moon peaked. It began when the boy was 6. He would shiver in bed, then burn. Sometimes he would scream. Not words, just sounds. Other times, he would whisper things he couldn't know. Names of the dead. Secrets no child should carry. And then by morning, he would be fine, for another month. The local healer called it moonstruck, a word spoken with a whisper. A mix of awe and fear. The church didn't like it. The moon was God's creation, but even they had no better answer. They simply prayed harder during the full moons, and the priests clutched their crosses tighter when the sick began to moan. There were charts too. In larger towns, scribes kept records of the sky, which moon brought plague, which brought madness. Some said the moon pulled on the blood, like it pulled the tides, that it disturbed the humors. The black bile, the yellow bile, the phlegm and blood, throwing the body into chaos. Others said it lit the path for spirits, that under a full moon the boundary between this world and the next thinned, and the sick were the ones the spirits touched first. Whatever the cause, one truth remained. People got sick, and the moon was always watching. Mothers tucked their children in tighter during those nights. Fathers set bowls of rosemary on the windowsill. Doors were barred early, lamps burned longer, and always, someone stared through the cracks in the shutter to see if the moon had risen. Because once it had, you couldn't undo it. Not every illness came with the moon, but many did, enough to make people whisper. Enough to make healers schedule bloodletting sessions before the full moon, never after. Enough to make even the bravest man knock 3 times on the chapel door and leave a coin for protection. And when the sickness passed, if it passed, no one spoke of it loudly. They waited for the next moon, and the next, and each time they hoped the light would pass over their rooftops, that it would shine on someone else, or maybe no one at all. But deep down they knew the moon didn't forget. It only waited, and in the end, no one truly escaped its gaze. Why they feared bad air at night. They shut the windows when the sun went down. Didn't matter if it was warm, didn't matter if the fire made the air inside thick and close. When the last light slipped behind the fields, and the shadows touched the eaves, the shutters closed with a soft thud, like the breath of the house itself being held. Because the night brought something more than darkness. It brought the bad air. They called it miasma. They didn't know the word for germs. They didn't know about tiny things in the blood, on the skin, in the water, but they knew this. People got sick at night, not just a little sick, not a sniffle or a sore throat, but fevers, sweats, coughs that rattled from the ribs, like something trying to escape. And when it happened, it often came without warning. The child who had laughed at supper might be burning by morning. The mother who hummed by the hearth might not wake. So they blamed the air, the dampness of it, the way it crept in low under doors, into corners. It smelled different, they said. Not always, but sometimes, a heavy, earthy scent, like rot, like old leaves and damp cellars, like a field left fallow too long, and once you breathed it in, it was too late. They lit bundles of dried herbs and waved them in circles around the room. They placed rosemary by the pillow, lavender on the sill. They burned vinegar-soaked cloth, not to freshen the air, to fight it. Because once the bad air settled, it didn't just make you sick, it lingered. There were houses no one went near, because the air around them was heavy. A whole family might fall ill, one by one, and still the windows stayed shut, as if letting the night in would finish what the illness started. Even priests, even they knocked before entering, and sometimes they left as quickly as they came. Not all air was dangerous, but no one could tell the difference. That's what made it so terrifying. A cool breeze through the shutters might mean nothing, or it might carry death, and by the time you knew which, it was already in your lungs. People walked quickly at night, wrapped scarves over their mouths, avoided low-lying roads and foggy fields, held sprigs of herbs under their noses, if they had to pass through a sick part of town, because it wasn't just the cough you feared, it was what you couldn't see, what you couldn't smell until it was too late. The air didn't have to look dark, it only had to touch you. That's why old grandmothers whispered warnings to the little ones. Close the door, keep your head covered, don't sleep near the draft. They weren't being overcautious, they were remembering, and still, every so often, someone forgot, or thought the wind too pleasant to fear, or cracked a shutter just to let the room breathe. And sometimes, nothing happened, but other times, the fever came that night, and the window never opened again. Why families slept in the same bed until the end? There weren't many rooms. In most homes there was one space for everything. Eating, working, sleeping, being born, and dying. The fire sat in the center like a small sun, and around it, people lived in a slow circle, never far from one another. So when night came, the family didn't scatter. They drew close, not just out of love, out of cold, out of fear, out of the simple need for warmth. They slept in the same bed, or on the same stretch of floor, bundled in cloaks and old linen. Children in the middle, elders on the sides. A shared blanket, a shared breath, a shared understanding that this, together, was the only safe way to rest. Beds weren't beds like we know them. Some were just straw piled in a corner. Others were wooden frames with ropes strung beneath sacks of hay. Over time the ropes sagged, the hay thinned. But people didn't complain. It was the nearness that mattered. When someone stirred, you felt it. When someone coughed, you knew. When someone whimpered in a fever dream, there was always a hand nearby to rest on their back. You were never alone, not even in sleep. Sometimes, that closeness saved lives. In winter, when frost crept through the cracks in the wall, body heat meant the difference between waking up or not. Babies survived the night because of it, so did grandfathers with fading lungs. But other times, that closeness passed along things that couldn't be taken back. Illness moved silently from one body to the next. A small shiver in a child might become a death rattle in the mother. Still, they didn't sleep apart. Couldn't, because there was no second bed, no extra room. And in the quiet logic of the time, there was no point in distance when fate had already chosen its path. In many homes, you were born in the same place you would die, beneath the same rafters, in the same narrow space, with the same voices whispering beside you. A family might sleep like that for decades. Children grew, parents aged. One day, someone wouldn't stir when the sun rose, but life continued in that same bed. Another body would take its place. The shape of the blanket would shift, but the warmth remained. They didn't think it odd. It wasn't strange to fall asleep next to someone coughing. It wasn't strange to listen to your brother's breathing slow in the dark. It wasn't strange to lay your head next to your mother's, even if she hadn't spoken in days, because that was how you showed love, not with distance, but with presence. In some places, people even believed the warmth of the family bed could hold off death, if not forever, then for one more night. There are stories of children sleeping beside their dying parents, holding their hands until they went still, of husbands whispering old songs into their wives' ears, long after they stopped replying, of old women wrapping arms around feverish grandsons, rocking them gently, knowing they wouldn't wake in the morning, but wanting them to feel held all the same, because in the end, that's what mattered most. Not how long you lived, but how closely you lived with others. The family bed was more than a place to sleep. It was the center of life, a shared space for stories, for grief, for warmth. And when death finally came, it wasn't met with loneliness, it was met with arms already around you.